In the winter of 1924, a small survey team working south of Dahshur stumbled upon a depression in the desert floor, a pit sealed with limestone blocks. Beneath it lay a staircase descending into the earth at a perfect 26-degree angle. No one knew then that this modest hole would open one of the strangest chapters in modern archaeology. What began as a simple survey soon turned into a descent into darkness, a place where ancient architecture met geological impossibility. The deeper they went, the more the instruments failed. Compasses spun, voices echoed where there should have been solid rock, and at the lowest level, the air itself seemed to hum. Tonight, we follow the real expedition logs, photographs, and accounts that were quietly sealed away, exploring what they found, and why the site was later abandoned without explanation. In 1842, a Prussian engineer named Carl Richard Lepsius drew a crude map of Dahshur, showing a structure that did not fit Egypt's known pyramids. His notes described a subterranean apex, a pyramid inverted into the earth. No one took it seriously until the same coordinates appeared again, 80 years later in an Egyptian survey report. At the time, Lepsius was leading one of the most ambitious archaeological surveys ever attempted under the Prussian Academy of Sciences. His mission was to document every visible pyramid and tomb along the Nile, from Memphis to Nubia, a monumental task that would later define early Egyptology. His drawings were methodical, careful, and deeply technical. Each symbol, each contour line, represented weeks of field measurement. Yet one small sketch, barely the size of a thumbnail in his Dahshur portfolio, stood apart. Instead of showing a structure rising from the desert, it showed one sinking into it, a stepped triangle drawn downward, annotated with a single word in German: Unterpyramid, the underpyramid. Historians later assumed this was a mistake, perhaps a copying error by one of Lepsius's assistants, but Lepsius was not prone to mistakes. His notes in the margins describe an artificial depression bordered by limestone debris and a sealed shaft descending at uniform angle. The entry was brief, almost cautious, as if he feared professional ridicule. After all, no one in the 19th century believed the ancient Egyptians built downward in such a manner. The Great Pyramids of Giza and the Step Pyramid of Djoser had defined an upward legacy, monuments that reached for the sky, not for the depths. For decades, Lepsius's forgotten page sat undisturbed in Berlin's archives, catalogued as unverified anomaly. When his field papers were published posthumously in 1897, editors omitted the reference entirely. To them, it seemed a trivial curiosity among hundreds of precise measurements. Yet beneath the sands of Dahshur, something waited. 80 years later, in 1922, an Egyptian topographer working under the Ministry of Antiquities compiled a survey of minor depressions around Dahshur's Red Pyramid. The purpose was mundane: to locate stable ground for an upcoming rail extension. Among the coordinates listed was a circular pit marked Depth Unknown, positioned within 50 meters of the same latitude and longitude that Lepsius had scribbled in his notes. The surveyor mentioned scattered limestone blocks arranged in an unnatural arc and a possible sealed cavity. His report, filed in Cairo's archives, gathered dust for decades. When the British-Egyptian joint excavations of the early 1922 began, attention centered on the Bent Pyramid and Snefrus complex. Nobody had reason to reopen Lepsius's anomaly, but one engineer on the Dahshur site, a young structural specialist named Henri Dupont, encountered the forgotten map while reviewing early cartographic sources. The matching coordinates caught his attention immediately. In his field journal, he wrote, "If the map is accurate, something lies beneath us that predates Snefru's base grid. The gradient is identical to pyramid descents but reversed. A mirror pyramid, underground." Dupont's superiors dismissed the idea, No Egyptian would bury a pyramid, one supervisor told him. They built toward eternity, not into darkness. Yet Dupont quietly marked the location on his own map, with a red triangle inverted the same symbol Lepsius had drawn a century before. It would take 2 more years and a routine geotechnical survey before ground-penetrating augers struck a layer of limestone blocks precisely where both men had indicated. When the first core samples came up, they showed polished faces on both sides, interior and exterior, as if the stone had been shaped for viewing from within. Later analysis of Lepsius's surviving sketches revealed even more unsettling consistency. His compass bearings and angle measurements aligned perfectly with the 26-degree descent later documented in the 1924 Dahshur expedition logs. What Lepsius saw in 1842 was not imagination. It was the first hint of an underground architectural complex no one was ready to acknowledge. Today, his forgotten map remains stored in Berlin's Egyptian Museum archives, its edges browned by age, its ink fading but still legible. A single line of text, underlined twice in his own hand, reads simply, "Not a hill, a door," and that door, hidden beneath Dahshur's sands for thousands of years, was about to be opened. The 1,924 survey team expected sand and rubble. Instead, their lanterns illuminated smooth-cut limestone walls descending into a geometric passage that seemed deliberately engineered. The angle was identical to that used in pyramid shafts, but this one went down, not up. The discovery came almost by accident. The men were clearing what they assumed was the collapsed roof of an ancient tomb. The first hammer strike revealed not loose fill but a line of stone blocks, polished and uniform. The excavation leader, engineer Henri Dupont, halted work immediately. He ordered the dust cleared with brushes, and by late afternoon, a narrow stairway emerged, 23 steps of limestone perfectly aligned at 26 degrees. Beneath the desert sun, the pale surface gleamed like the flank of a buried monument. By dusk, the team had set up camp around the depression. The entrance faced precisely north by northeast, an orientation typical of Old Kingdom pyramid shafts. Yet the workmanship was far older in appearance. The limestone lacked chisel marks, as if melted and reformed. Dupont recorded in his field notes, "These steps appear as though carved by light rather than hand." So what? 5. The next morning, they began the descent. Each man carried an oil lantern and a simple toolkit. The first few meters felt ordinary enough, the air dry, the walls cool, but as the daylight vanished behind them, the atmosphere changed. Sound grew muffled, footsteps echoed faintly, and the air took on a metallic tang. Their compasses, hanging from their belts, began to twitch. The passage extended far longer than expected. At 10 meters down, the ceiling dropped just enough that the men were forced to stoop. Dupont ran his hand along the wall and found a groove so straight it could have been cut by machine. The walls met at perfect right angles. Every 20 steps, a small recess was carved into the side, as if meant to hold a torch or offering. Midway down, the foreman, Abbas Fathi, noticed markings etched faintly into the limestone. They weren't hieroglyphs, at least, not in any form known at the time. The symbols resembled geometric spirals and parallel lines intersecting at measured points. They repeated every few meters, always aligned to the same compass direction. When Dupont tried to sketch them, he found they shifted under the flicker of the flame, appearing to twist inward, like motion captured in stone. At 15 meters, the floor began to vibrate subtly, as though resonating to a distant hum. The sound seemed to come from deep below, a low-frequency pulse that registered more in the chest than the ears. The men stopped to listen. The vibration ceased instantly, as if aware of their attention. Dupont noted in his diary that the phenomenon repeated several times during the descent, never regular, always responsive. The stairway ended in a rectangular landing, where the air grew noticeably colder. When they measured the incline, it remained constant to the fraction of a degree. The geometry was immaculate. No natural fissure could maintain such precision, Dupont wrote. This was designed, not eroded. In the far wall, a narrow corridor extended into darkness, lined with the same mirror-smooth stone. The team set up a tripod and lowered a string with a lead weight. It touched solid ground just 2 meters in. A sealed door, perhaps, or another flight of steps hidden beneath silt. When they tapped it with a hammer, the echo returned deep and hollow. By the time they surfaced, night had fallen. The men spoke little, exhausted and uneasy. Their watches disagreed by several minutes, though all had been synchronized before the descent. Dupont stared at the horizon where the red pyramid silhouette stood against the stars and wrote a final line in his log that night. "We have found a passage built to descend forever, and yet it feels as though something within it was meant to rise. It would take them 3 more days and 1 broken seal before they learned how far down that passage truly went." At 12 meters below ground, the explorers stopped to catch their breath. The air was unnaturally cold, metallic, and dry. Their barometers registered a pressure drop. The deeper chambers seemed to breathe, as if connected to a space far larger than the tunnel itself. At first, they assumed a natural cavity lay somewhere ahead, perhaps an underground aquifer or collapsed tomb shaft allowing air to circulate. But as they examined the readings, the data made less sense. The barometer needle fluctuated rhythmically, rising and falling every few seconds, like the pulse of a living thing. When the men extinguished their lanterns to rest, they could hear it faintly, a whispering rush, deep and continuous, as if the entire structure inhaled and exhaled beneath them. Dupont ordered the men to pause and seal the entry above, using canvas sheets to control airflow. When they did, the sound persisted, unaffected by any change in pressure from above. Whatever moved the air was not external wind. It came from within. The realization unsettled even the hardened engineers. This was not a tomb breathing out trapped gases. It was movement deliberate, cyclic, and measured. To test the current, Dupont tore a strip of silk from a surveying flag and held it in the beam of the lantern. The fabric fluttered gently toward the lower passage, drawn by an invisible current. When he shifted position, the pull reversed, blowing upward from the same direction moments later. The air was not simply escaping it, oscillated, changing direction at intervals. The rhythm matched the barometric pulse precisely. 9 seconds between each shift, like the lungs of the earth. Abbas muttered, his voice trembling slightly. Dupont said nothing, but in his diary he later wrote that the air felt alive, and that the metallic tang left a faint numbness on the tongue, the kind associated with ionized particles or proximity to electrical discharge. Yet there were no visible sparks, no heat, no light, only the constant thrum beneath the stone. When the team descended another 2 meters, the phenomenon intensified. The flame of their lanterns bent sideways, and droplets of condensation formed along the wall seams, even though the surrounding air was dry. Touching the stone produced a mild static crackle. One of the assistants reported hearing what he described as a low drone, a tone just at the edge of hearing. Within minutes, all of them could feel it, a pressure behind the ears, subtle but persistent, the way altitude sickness begins. Dupont ordered a temporary retreat to the surface for recalibration. Once above ground, their instruments returned to normal immediately. The same barometer that had fluctuated wildly now held steady. There were no weather changes to explain it. The desert night was still and windless. Back at camp, the geologist on the team, Dr. El Said, suggested the anomaly could be due to barometric inversion caused by air trapped in a series of descending cavities. But he admitted the measured oscillation was too regular for a natural phenomenon. "It's like a mechanical pump," he said quietly. "Only made of rock." The following morning, they resumed the descent with additional sensors and marked the walls every meter for data points. The readings revealed something even stranger. The temperature did not rise with depth as expected, but fell sharply, dropping nearly 6 degrees Celsius in less than 10 meters. In ordinary shafts, trapped heat builds. Here, something drew warmth away, as though the chamber below acted as a vast cold sink. When they finally reached the 12th marker again, the hum had grown faintly musical harmonics vibrating through the floor, forming patterns in the dust like ripples in water. Each tone persisted for several seconds before fading into silence. The men stood motionless, listening. Dupont scribbled a final note before closing his log for the night. "This air is not dead. It carries a memory. The deeper we go, the more it remembers us." And from that moment on, every breath they took beneath Dahshur carried the weight of something watching unseen, but very much aware. When the team called out, their voices did not bounce back in the expected rhythm. The echo returned, delayed, split, and strangely tonal, as though resonating through hollow stone. The sound engineer recorded it on wax cylinders later marked acoustic anomaly. The phenomenon revealed itself on the third day underground. The explorers had cleared the lower gallery, a narrow hall running east to west beneath the main stairway, expecting solid resonance from the limestone walls. Instead, each word they spoke seemed to break apart and return from multiple directions. When Dupont said, "Test," the word came back stretched, distorted and layered, as if several unseen voices repeated it slightly out of phase. The delay was measurable, nearly 1.5 seconds longer than the echo from any known cavity of comparable size. Sound engineer Charles Duret, who had joined the expedition to document environmental audio for mapping, set up his primitive recording device, a brass horn leading into a wax cylinder phonograph. He placed the horn at various points along the passage and clapped once. The playback later showed something extraordinary, faint harmonics between each echo, forming intervals of exact musical ratios. Duret described them as unnaturally pure tones, the kind produced not by random reflection but by a tuned structure. Dupont ordered the team to halt excavation until they understood what caused the resonance. They measured the corridor meticulously. 31 meters long, 3 meters high, two wide proportions that, by chance or intention, mirrored the harmonic ratios of a 4:3 musical scale. When they projected a sustained hum from one end, the opposite wall answered in perfect fifths. It was as if the entire passage had been engineered as a musical instrument carved from the earth itself. The men grew uneasy. The vibrations affected more than sound, they could feel it. When Duret tested lower frequencies using a portable tone generator, the lantern flames trembled in unison. Dust rose from the floor in concentric rings. At a certain pitch, the stone itself seemed to tremble. One worker dropped his hammer, convinced the ceiling was moving, yet the seismic meters above ground registered nothing. Dupont noted in his journal, "It is possible the builders tuned this chamber to respond to human voice, amplifying speech as resonance rather than reflection. If so, this was not a burial corridor. It was a device perhaps for ceremony, perhaps for communication." The deeper they tested, the stranger it became. The echoes changed depending on who spoke. The baritone voices returned louder and sharper. Higher tones produced faint, flute-like harmonics. When Duret whispered in French, the returning echo carried a tone that sounded almost like words in another language, a rhythmic pattern of syllables that none could identify. The team began referring to it as the answering voice. That night, Dupont replayed the recordings outside their tent. The desert wind drowned most of the low tones, but one fragment remained clear, a faint, rhythmic pulse like chanting from far below. It repeated in cycles, rising and fading in perfect intervals, Even Dure, ever the skeptic, stopped the cylinder and stared at the horn. "No echo behaves like that," he said quietly. "It's as though something was calling back." In later decades, acoustic archaeologists who analysed the surviving cylinders confirmed that the echoes contained frequencies beyond human hearing, subsonic vibrations between 15 and 18 Hz, capable of inducing unease or dizziness. Modern physicists now call this the infrasound effect, known to disturb the human nervous system. Yet in 1924, no one could explain why a limestone corridor would generate it. Before sealing the site for the night, Dupont walked the length of the gallery alone. He stood in the centre and whispered a single phrase, "Who are you?" The echo that followed was not delayed but immediate, a perfect whisper, returning the same words, syllable for syllable. When he climbed back to camp, pale and silent, he told Duret to label the wax cylinders and pack them away. The entry in his log that evening was brief. Sound behaves as if it remembers the speaker. The walls are not reflecting us, they are listening. At 20 meters down, the limestone walls gave way to granite slabs tilted at precise angles. Each slab weighed several tons, yet had been positioned with perfect symmetry. What purpose this shifting geometry served remains unknown. The passageway opened into a space unlike anything the team had yet encountered, a chamber both narrow and immense, its proportions distorted by slanted planes that caught and fractured the lantern light. The walls were built from massive granite panels, each leaning slightly inward, forming what Dupont described as a hall of folded stone. The floor too was uneven, rising and dipping in measured intervals. When the men stood still, the angles created the illusion that the entire room was subtly rotating. It took hours for the surveyors to map even a fraction of the layout. The geometry was deliberate. Every block leaned at the same exact degree, 12.5, alternating direction in a mirrored pattern. None rested flush against the other, leaving paper-thin seams through which the air moved with a faint hum. When Dupont held his ear to the gap, he heard a distant vibration, steady as a machine in motion. Duret, still carrying his phonograph, tested the chamber's acoustics by striking a chisel against one of the slabs. The sound rang out, pure and metallic, sustaining for several seconds before fading into a chorus of faint overtones. "Not echo," he said. "Resonance." When he repeated the strike on an adjacent block, the tone changed higher, sharper. Each slab sang a different note. The engineers began to suspect the chamber functioned as an enormous resonator. The pattern of tilted blocks resembled the baffles inside modern acoustic chambers, except these had been built more than 10,000 years earlier, using stones weighing several tons apiece. Dupont theorized that the design could amplify or shape sound waves, perhaps to focus vibration downward toward the deeper shafts. But the reason for doing so, or the knowledge required to achieve it, defied explanation. The granite itself added to the mystery. Analysis of a small fragment revealed it contained traces of magnetite and quartz minerals, capable of producing piezoelectric effects when subjected to pressure or sound. When struck or vibrated, they can generate electric charge. To the expedition scientists, this was coincidence. To later researchers, it hinted at something far stranger. A structure designed not merely to contain sound, but to convert it into energy. Late that evening, Dupont ordered all lamps extinguished to test how light behaved in total darkness. The chamber responded in unexpected ways. Even without flame, faint lines of luminescence appeared along the seams between blocks, a pale bluish glow, shifting like heat haze. It was too dim to see clearly, yet enough to trace the pattern of interlocking angles across the walls. The team assumed it was due to phosphorescent minerals, but none were found in subsequent samples. As they continued to explore, one worker noticed that their compasses spun faster inside the chamber than anywhere else. The magnetism was strongest at the central axis, where two tilted planes met in a point. They placed a metal spike there for measurement, and within minutes it began to vibrate without being touched, producing a low humming tone audible to everyone present. The sound stopped the moment they tried to remove it. That night, Dupont recorded in his diary, "Geometry and sound appear joined by design. The builders understood both weight and vibration as living forces. We stand inside a mechanism, not a room." Before leaving, he ran his gloved hand along one of the slabs. The surface was warm, despite the freezing air around it. He pressed his palm flat and felt an almost imperceptible movement beneath the stone, a slow, rhythmic shifting, as though the blocks themselves were adjusting by degrees, maintaining the precision of their angles. No one slept well that night. The men reported hearing faint scraping noises from below the tent floor, timed at regular intervals. Dupont dismissed it as the desert wind against the excavation frame, but in his private field log, his words betrayed doubt. The stones are moving in ways they should not. We measure them, and they measure us back. The expedition's compasses began spinning without pattern. Magnetometers registered interference, like that seen near meteorite iron. The team's photographs came out, fogged as though exposed to radiation or heat, though the air remained cold. At first, the crew thought their instruments had simply failed. The underground humidity, the constant dust, and the mechanical strain of descent had already caused several minor malfunctions. But this was different. Every compass needle turned slowly in a circle, stopping briefly, then spinning again in the opposite direction. Their readings shifted even when the devices were moved away from metal tools. Dupont ordered one compass placed outside, 20 meters from the entrance. The same effect occurred. The magnetometers fared no better. Their needles oscillated wildly, then froze. Duret recalibrated the devices, using standard iron control samples, but even those showed inconsistent magnetic pull, as though the very polarity of the site were fluctuating. One instrument operator swore that the ground beneath him gave off a faint vibration that pulsed in sync with the compass swings. When Dupont laid his hand to the floor, he could feel it too, a tremor so subtle it seemed to pass through bone rather than earth. Photographs from that day would later puzzle analysts. Out of 20 glass plates developed in Cairo, 15 were unusable, veiled in a ghostly mist. The images that did survive showed blurred edges around the light sources, halos of distortion, and faint concentric rings. When examined under magnification, each plate revealed microscopic patterns resembling interference waves, the sort produced by electromagnetic exposure. The conditions underground, however, did not support such interference. There was no heat source, no known radiation, no active metals. The air remained cold enough to condense their breath. Even the lantern flames, which had burned steady in earlier chambers, began to flicker in irregular pulses, their wicks bending toward the granite walls as if drawn by an invisible current. Dupont, who prided himself on his rationalism, found himself scribbling contradictory explanations. In one note, he blamed static discharge from subterranean quartz. In the next, he admitted the readings exceeded what piezoelectric reactions could produce. "It is as if magnetism here is alive," he wrote. Not constant, but breathing. The effects grew stranger the deeper they ventured. Watches lost synchronization within minutes. A chronometer that ticked with perfect precision at camp began running slow, then fast, then stopped altogether when placed on the chamber floor. The air buzzed faintly, like the hum of an electrical wire. Duret described feeling a tingling on his fingertips whenever he held his camera near the stone. At one point, an assistant attempted to use a metal plumb line to measure the vertical drop of the next shaft. The line refused to hang straight. It swayed steadily toward the north wall, repelled from true vertical as though a magnetic force pulled sideways. Dupont recorded this deviation precisely. 17 degrees from vertical, consistent across every point in the chamber. When they surfaced for the evening, the instruments returned to normal almost immediately. The compasses aligned, the chronometers resumed regular rhythm, and the magnetometers stabilized. Yet when they carried one of the granite samples above ground for study, the needle again began to tremble. Whatever caused the distortion was bound to the stone itself. The team sent a small fragment to the Cairo laboratory for analysis. 2 weeks later, a telegram arrived. Sample exhibits residual magnetization equivalent to high nickel meteorite. Origin indeterminate. The fragment contained trace isotopes rare even in iron-rich meteor debris. DuPont shared the results with no one outside the core team. In his personal log, he noted that standing too long near the tilted walls produced nausea and a faint ringing in the ears. Duret complained of blurred vision that persisted for hours after exposure to the lower gallery. Others began to suffer headaches, dizziness, and sleeplessness. One worker swore he saw a flicker of light move within the granite itself, like lightning trapped in stone. The team dismissed it as fatigue, but that night, when DuPont developed his final set of plates, the image showed exactly that. A streak of illumination curving across the wall, frozen in a single frame. The caption he wrote beneath it was simple, almost clinical. The stone emits light invisible to the eye. The instruments are blind, but the chamber is not. When the lead archaeologist knelt to test the ground, his hammer rang hollow. Beneath a layer of stone dust lay a hidden panel, carved to fit so precisely that it vanished into the floor. Beneath it, another stairway, descending into total darkness. At first, DuPont believed it was a natural cavity, perhaps a collapsed pocket of sand sealed by the shifting desert over time. But the sound was too perfect, the resonance too clean. A second strike echoed like metal under tension, ringing out through the chamber before fading into an unnatural silence. The men exchanged uncertain glances. If the floor was hollow, it meant the structure beneath their feet continued even deeper. With deliberate care, they began clearing the surface dust. Each brushstroke revealed tighter seams, impossibly precise joints no thicker than a hair, cut in a pattern of concentric rectangles. The slabs themselves were warm to the touch, as if heat pulsed faintly from below. When DuPont placed a lantern near the center, its flame bent inward toward the seams, drawn by a current they couldn't see. Using small chisels, they loosened the corner of one panel. The moment it lifted, a draft of cool air rushed out, sharp, dry, and heavy, with the scent of minerals and age. It extinguished 2 lanterns instantly. The barometers dipped again, and a faint humming rose from beneath. It wasn't the steady vibration they'd heard earlier, but a distant, irregular pulse, like a heartbeat muffled by stone. As the slab shifted, the lantern light revealed the upper edge of another stairway spiraling downward. The steps were narrower this time, carved from black basalt instead of limestone. Each tread bore faint grooves, worn smooth by something or someone long ago. DuPont tested the edge with a rope and dropped a stone into the darkness. It took nearly 7 seconds before the sound of impact returned, echoing through layers of unseen chambers below. "Too deep for a burial shaft," said Abbas quietly. "And too narrow for a royal passage," DuPont agreed. The precision of the seal suggested intention. The builders had not wanted anyone to find it. Still, curiosity outweighed caution. He ordered the team to secure ropes, harnesses, and a tripod over the opening. The descent, he decided, would begin at dawn. That night, no one slept easily. The sand around the excavation pit trembled at irregular intervals, and several men claimed to hear a faint tapping from below, rhythmic, deliberate, like distant footsteps. Duret, ever the rationalist, dismissed it as the settling of stone under pressure. Yet in his field diary he admitted privately that he had heard it too. "It sounded," he wrote, like the echo of a hammer striking from the other side. At sunrise, Dupont was the first to descend. The basalt steps absorbed light instead of reflecting it, swallowing the beam of his lantern until it seemed to hang in mid-air without illuminating the walls. The air grew colder, but the smell of iron and something faintly electrical lingered. He counted 20 steps before reaching a narrow landing, a platform suspended over a void. His voice, when he called up to the others, returned, warped and hollow, as though travelling through metal pipes. When the second lantern was lowered, it revealed what lay ahead. A circular shaft plunging straight down through the rock. Its walls were lined with smooth vertical grooves, spiraling faintly in a pattern that suggested machining rather than chiselling. At the base of the shaft, too far to see clearly, there appeared to be a faint reflection, like still water or polished stone. Dupont ordered the descent halted until they could measure the depth accurately. As he secured the rope, he noticed the panel above, the one they had lifted, beginning to shift on its own weight, settling back toward its original position. The edges met perfectly again, sealing the chamber above with a sound like a deep sigh. For several long seconds, the light flickered. The team stood frozen in the stairwell, trapped between two layers of the earth. Dupont exhaled slowly and whispered, "We're inside a mechanism that resets itself." He would later write that it felt less like uncovering architecture and more like waking it up. This new stairwell spiraled counterclockwise, a rarity in Egyptian architecture. The walls were polished to a mirror finish that reflected their torchlight in infinite repetitions. It was as if they were walking inside a lens. Descending that stairway felt less like entering a structure and more like being drawn into a vortex. The smooth basalt curved around them in a seamless spiral, its surface so perfectly polished that their reflections twisted and elongated, merging torchlight and shadow into endless rings of movement. Each turn of the staircase seemed to distort space. The same number of steps leading down always brought them deeper than their calculations should have allowed. The air grew colder still, and every sound, even a whisper, seemed to circle endlessly around the walls before fading into a low hum. Unlike the upper corridors, this passage bore no tool marks, no chisel lines, no sign of manual labour. Dupont examined the surface with his magnifier and found that even under close inspection the stone was flawless, as though it had been melted, shaped, and cooled as a single continuous form. "It is as if the rock had flowed," he wrote, "and then been frozen mid-motion." At 5 meters down, the first of many strange optical effects appeared. The torchlight reflected back from the wall not as yellow, but as pale white, as though filtered through glass. When Duret moved his lantern, the reflections didn't follow. Instantly, they lagged, sliding along the walls a moment after the movement. The team stood motionless, trying to understand whether it was an illusion or a property of the material itself. The delay persisted. "Perhaps it is the air," said Abbas. "The density is different here." He struck a match and watched it burn without flickering, the flame standing upright and motionless. Even the smoke drifted straight down the stairs, as if gravity had reversed. The spiral wound deeper, the air turning denser and metallic in taste. At every 12th step, the walls bore a faint horizontal line that glowed faintly when the torchlight dimmed a band of light only visible in near darkness. When they placed a hand to it, the glow pulsed once and faded. None of the men could explain it. By the third rotation of the stairwell, Dupont's altimeter indicated a depth exceeding 40 meters, but the slope showed no sign of ending. What struck them most was the silence. Even their breathing sounded distant, as if absorbed by the walls. The usual scrape of boots against stone made no echo at all. Only the rhythmic drip of condensation broke the stillness, droplets falling onto the steps below, evaporating before they hit the ground. Halfway down, the spiral opened briefly into a landing. There, embedded into the outer wall, they found a series of circular recesses no wider than a man's arm. When Duret placed a hand inside one, A faint vibration coursed through his wrist, steady, electrical, like the hum of a generator. He withdrew instantly, his fingertips pale and numb. "It's moving," he said. But the others felt nothing when they tried. The deeper they went, the more disorienting the reflections became. Their torchlight seemed to multiply into dozens of floating orbs circling around them. At one point, Dupont swore he saw another figure descending just ahead, a silhouette identical to his own but reversed, as if reflected from below. He called out, but the shadow did not respond. Finally, the stairway ended at a flat platform of black glass-like stone. In the center stood a narrow archway, its frame cut from the same seamless material. No carvings, no hieroglyphs, only precision-perfect curves in utter darkness. When they looked into the archway, their lanterns failed to illuminate the space beyond. The light vanished inside, as though swallowed by water. Dupont instructed Duret to take a photograph, but the moment the shutter clicked, every torch dimmed simultaneously, and a low vibration passed through the floor, not an earthquake, but something deeper, resonant, deliberate. The sound faded after several seconds, replaced by silence so complete that even their own heartbeat seemed too loud. Dupont turned to the others and whispered, "This isn't a stairway at all. It's a conduit." He later wrote in his private log, "The descent was not through space alone. The air grew heavier, the time slower. I believe we crossed into a place where distance folds, where light remembers where it has been." At the base of the spiral, the explorers found a small chamber filled with fine sand, yet none of it touched the floor. Grains floated in the air, held in motionless suspension as though caught between magnetic fields. When disturbed, they settled briefly, then rose again. The men stood frozen at the threshold, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Their lantern light illuminated millions of tiny particles shimmering in mid-air, forming faint streams that twisted and curled as if following invisible currents. The floor beneath was perfectly smooth and dark, untouched by dust or debris. For several moments no one dared move. Even their breath sent ripples through the suspended grains, creating waves that propagated outward like the surface of disturbed water. Except these waves moved through air, not liquid. Dupont was the first to step forward. He reached out with a gloved hand, and the nearest cluster of sand recoiled from his touch, dispersing briefly before returning to its original shape. It was as though the material had memory, restoring its position after interference. Duret, attempting to photograph the phenomenon, discovered that his camera's exposure plate failed to capture anything beyond a silvery blur, as if the particles emitted or reflected light outside the visible spectrum. When Dupont knelt to test the floor, his fingertips brushed something slick and cold, not stone, but glass. The entire chamber appeared to rest atop a layer of fused material, perfectly level and without joints. Beneath it, a faint luminescence glowed pale blue, pulsing with the same rhythm they had felt in the air above. The suspended grains seemed to respond to this pulse, rising and falling in slow synchronization, like dust trapped inside a silent heartbeat. Abbas, ever cautious, measured the air pressure inside the chamber and found it lower than outside by a margin too large to be natural. The space behaved as if sealed, maintaining its own internal balance. When he placed a small brass weight into the air, it fell halfway, slowed, and then stopped hanging, perfectly still among the grains, before gently drifting sideways. Gravity here seemed negotiable. "It's impossible," whispered Duret. "The sand should fall, it should obey," but nothing did. Every motion was gradual, deliberate, almost graceful. The explorers quickly realized that any disturbance, a sound, a breath, even the flicker of their lanterns changed the configuration of the particles. Some began to cluster into faint geometric forms. Spirals, cones, and hovering planes that shimmered like smoke made solid. Dupont recognized the symmetry instantly, ratios identical to those of the chamber above. where the granite blocks had been cut at 12.5-degree angles. The same proportions now existed here, drawn not in stone but in air. He ordered the men to remain silent while he tested the reaction of sound. With a slow exhale, he hummed a single sustained note. To everyone's astonishment, the grains began to move, rising higher, forming rings that vibrated with the tone. When he stopped, they froze again, suspended mid-pattern. "Resonance," said Dupont softly. The chamber listens. The discovery unsettled everyone. It suggested the builders had not only mastered stone and magnetism, but also the manipulation of air itself. Duret speculated that the sand could be charged electrically, each grain holding a static polarity that kept it afloat. But Dupont's calculations dismissed that idea. The charge required would have vaporized the air. Something else was maintaining balance, something unseen and unmeasurable by their instruments. Before leaving, Dupont scraped a handful of grains into a sealed vial. As he withdrew, the remaining sand seemed to recoil slightly, the patterns collapsing, the floating geometry breaking apart. Once the vial was corked, the contents fell to the bottom instantly, behaving like ordinary sand. But when the jar was brought near the chamber again, the grains stirred and rose once more, as if awakening. Dupont's final entry for the day read, "Matter here behaves as if it remembers its place. Remove it from the chamber and it forgets. Return it, and it recalls. The sand is not floating, it is waiting." That night, back at camp, the vial emitted a faint glow through the glass, and before dawn, the sand inside had vanished entirely, leaving only a hollow jar and the lingering scent of ozone. A doorway blocked by a carved slab bore the oldest form of hieratic writing ever documented at Dahshur. The inscription referenced the descent of the sun beneath the eye of Ra, a phrase absent from any temple text above ground. The discovery halted the excavation entirely. For hours, the men stood in silence before the slab, their lanterns casting restless shadows across the delicate carvings. The doorway was no wider than a coffin lid, its surface blackened with age yet still intact. Unlike most hieratic inscriptions, which were written hastily with reed pens, this text had been carved, each line deeply etched into the stone, as though the writer intended the message to endure forever. The hieratic symbols themselves were archaic, predating the earliest known variants from the First Dynasty. Some resembled protoglyphs, half-formed ancestors of the hieroglyphs that would later appear in temple walls. Dupont immediately summoned the expedition's epigrapher, Dr. Yusuf Hamad, who spent the next 6 hours hunched over the slab by lamplight, tracing every curve and mark. His early notes were cautious, but his expression betrayed awe. "It's not a funerary warning," he whispered. "It's directional, instructional." The translation, recorded in his notebook and later verified by Cairo scholars, read, "Where the light goes blind, the sun walks below the eye. He who follows must not speak, for sound disturbs the path." Beneath the text, a series of small cartouches contained geometric diagrams, concentric circles, and intersecting lines that resembled astronomical charts. The precision of these engravings astonished the team. When measured, the angles corresponded exactly to the inclination of the Dahshur shafts above 26 degrees. Somehow, whoever carved this had mapped the geometry of both the surface and the hidden architecture below. Dupont theorized that the phrase, "the descent of the sun," might refer to a solar alignment, a ritual designed to channel light into the subterranean chamber during a specific time of year. But the corridor they were in had never been exposed to sunlight. No shaft or opening connected it to the sky. If the text described a real event, it meant there was once a mechanism or an aperture through which light could reach the depths of the pyramid. As they examined the slab more closely, they noticed the writing shimmered faintly under torchlight. The grooves caught the flame and reflected it in golden flecks. Dr. Hamad suggested the incisions had been filled with a metallic paste, possibly a mixture of copper and powdered gold. They wanted the words to shine, he said, perhaps to mimic sunlight where none could reach, yet it was what lay beneath the inscription that most disturbed the team. At the bottom of the slab, nearly invisible at first glance, were several horizontal scratches, newer than the rest, almost desperate. They appeared to have been carved with a sharp instrument by hand. When traced, they formed crude letters in Latin script C.W. 1000. 889, Dupont froze. There was no record of any expedition at Dahshur in 1889. The British survey did not extend that far south until 1892. Who had come before them, and how had they reached this depth without documentation? Determined to proceed, Dupont ordered the slab examined for weak points. Hammer strikes produced a dull resonance, suggesting the stone was backed by an open void. They drilled a small bore through an existing crack, expecting solid resistance. Instead, the drill sank easily and then broke off with a metallic snap. A gust of air escaped through the opening, cold and dry, carrying the faint scent of resin and something older, something metallic and burnt. When the lantern was held close, the flame bent sharply toward the hole, as though drawn inward. Whatever lay behind the slab seemed to pull at the air itself. The sound that followed was faint but unmistakable. A hollow, low-pitched vibration that rose, peaked, and then vanished. Dupont and Doctor Hammond exchanged a look of silent understanding. The slab was not just a door, it was a seal. The inscription was not meant to invite entry, but to warn against it. That night, Dupont's field notes grew darker in tone. The final line beneath his translation read, "The Eye of Ra watches not from the sky but from below." 2 days later, despite Hamad's objections, Dupont ordered the seal broken. Breaking the seal took nearly 2 days. When the slab finally fell inward, a gust of air extinguished every flame. Electric lamps flickered and dimmed. The tunnel beyond appeared dry, yet every surface glistened as though wet. The sound of the falling slab rolled away into the depths, swallowed by the earth. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air that spilled out felt charged, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. Dupont signalled the men to wait until the dust settled. Then he stepped forward, lantern in hand, and crossed the threshold. The corridor beyond was unlike anything they had seen. Its walls were smooth, almost metallic, and curved slightly inward as if shaped by pressure rather than hand. Every beam of light fractured into pale reflections that slid along the stone like water. The surface wasn't wet. It was alive with microscopic crystals that shimmered faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the hum still resonating from the broken seal. They moved carefully, measuring every few meters. The air pressure fluctuated, and their compasses spun again. Duret checked his camera, only to find the lens fogged, though the air was bone dry. Each photograph he took turned out blank, as though the film refused to hold the image. Halfway down, the floor changed texture from rough basalt to something glass-like. When Dupont tested it with the butt of his hammer, the sound rang high and clear, reverberating through the walls. It didn't echo back. Instead, the tone elongated, repeating softly until it faded into the hum of the tunnel. At the far end, a doorway glowed faintly with blue light. Its frame was carved with intricate hieratic symbols, simpler than those on the seal, yet aligned with a precision that suggested geometry rather than art. Hamad read what he could. "It repeats the same phrase," he said. "The path of the blind light." When Dupont reached for the frame, a vibration rippled through the floor, gentle but steady. The lantern flame stretched sideways, bending toward the doorway as though pulled. For a second, the light dimmed to near darkness, then flared back with twice its strength. Inside the doorway lay nothing visible, just an expanse of deep, matte black. It wasn't shadow, it was the absence of reflection itself. When DuPont shone the beam directly in, it did not return. Even the dust motes floating near the opening vanished the moment they crossed its threshold. The men said little. Duret recorded a final note on his malfunctioning phonograph. The static thick, with a faint, rhythmic tone underneath steady, heartbeat-like. DuPont's last journal entry for that day read simply, "We thought we had found another chamber." It is not a chamber. It is an event. The light enters and does not return. Thanks for watching, as whirled into the snow. Beyond the doorway lay a corridor 200 meters long, supported by beams of an unknown dark stone harder than basalt. The material produced sparks when struck, yet no known quarry in Egypt contained anything like it. The passage stretched into shadow, narrow yet perfectly straight. When the men raised their lanterns, the black pillars seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. The stone surfaces were smooth to the touch, but cold, unnaturally so, as if they absorbed warmth from the air. Duret chipped a small flake from one of the beams, and the impact created a bright flash like striking flint. The fragment, when examined later, was denser than granite and faintly metallic, leaving behind a magnetic trace on the compass. DuPont ordered precise measurements of the gallery. Every 10 meters, the floor bore engraved recesses, small square sockets, too shallow for torches, too regular for natural erosion. Hamad theorized they once held fittings or mechanisms, though for what purpose no one could guess. Even the ceiling was unusual. A continuous arch formed from a single slab of the same unknown material, its curvature mathematically perfect. The air felt still, as if sealed in a vacuum. At the 20-meter mark, Abbas noticed something strange, faint lines running horizontally across the walls, almost invisible until the lantern light caught them at the right angle. When traced, they formed a repeating pattern resembling circuitry, intricate channels branching and reconnecting, leading toward the far end of the passage. Duret sketched the layout and later compared it to early electrical schematics. The resemblance was undeniable. As they advanced deeper, the instruments began to fail again. The compass spun wildly, barometers fluctuated, and even the phonograph emitted faint static though it was switched off. DuPont noted the temperature dropping with every step. By the halfway point, their breath was visible. The sound of their footsteps, normally crisp on stone, now echoed with a slight delay, as though bouncing through a space much larger than the corridor itself. At 100 meters, the walls began to vibrate faintly. Not with noise, but with resonance, a subtle hum that could be felt through fingertips pressed to the stone. The effect intensified whenever anyone spoke. Their voices triggered faint tremors, as though the gallery was tuned to sound. When Duret whistled softly, the tone reverberated down the entire hall, splitting into two pitches that harmonized before fading. DuPont described the experience as walking inside an instrument. They reached the end after nearly an hour of cautious progress. There, the corridor terminated in a smooth wall with no carvings, no door, no visible seam, only a single vertical groove running from floor to ceiling, so narrow that even a knife blade could not enter. DuPont pressed his hand to it and felt a faint warmth pulsing beneath. He described it later as the sensation of something sleeping behind the stone. Duret photographed the wall, but the plate developed as a blank slate, pure white, as if overexposed. A second attempt produced the same result. When the photograph was enlarged under magnification, a faint geometric pattern emerged, an outline of a doorway that had not been visible to the naked eye. DuPont concluded the gallery had been deliberately erased, sealed not by construction, but by transformation, as if the doorway had been fused shut by heat or energy. He ended that night's journal with a single line written in haste. The passage does not end, it hides. In their field notes, radio operator Malcolm Grant reported hearing faint Morse-like clicks through the static even though the transmitter was off. The pattern repeated every 46 seconds. He copied it down, but the sequence matched no known code. It began one night just after midnight, when the desert air was still and every instrument lay quiet. Grant had been checking the batteries for their field transmitter, ensuring nothing was left powered overnight, when he noticed a soft ticking coming through the receiver headphones. At first, he assumed it was mechanical noise, interference from a generator or an oscillating circuit. But the transmitter switch was in the off position, and the unit had been disconnected from its power source. Still, the sound persisted. Each pulse was sharp, deliberate 3 short clicks, a pause, then 5 slower ones, then a long drawn tone like a sustained signal. He noted the intervals and timing. 46 seconds later, the sequence began again, identical in rhythm and strength. When he moved the receiver closer to the stone wall, the signal grew louder. When he stepped back toward the camp, it faded to nothing. DuPont dismissed the anomaly as electromagnetic feedback caused by the mineral composition of the granite. Yet, when Grant used a second receiver, one isolated from all electrical equipment, the signal remained. The other men listened in turn, and all heard it faint but precise, too regular to be random noise. Over the next several hours, Grant recorded the transmissions onto wax cylinders. When replayed, the pattern produced low, rhythmic tones that, when slowed down, almost resembled speech, a cadence with inflection but no discernible words. Duret, listening with his head tilted, whispered, "It sounds like breathing through static." The next morning, they conducted tests throughout the corridor. The signal was strongest near the sealed archway they had uncovered earlier, where the walls vibrated subtly beneath touch. The magnetometer registered faint oscillations that synchronized exactly with the timing of the clicks. The origin seemed to come not from the air, but from within the stone itself. By the second night, the rhythm changed. The 46-second pattern shortened to 43, then 41. Grant noted the drift as if the source were compensating for interference adjusting. During the 4th cycle, a new sound appeared, layered beneath the clicks. A faint modulation that rose and fell like someone whispering through water. DuPont, increasingly uneasy, ordered the recordings sealed until they could be analysed in Cairo. But curiosity won out. Grant played the latest cylinder once more, amplifying the sound through a makeshift speaker cone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a deep hum filled the chamber, followed by a sharp feedback tone that sent the lanterns flickering. The playback stopped abruptly. The wax cylinder fractured by the vibration, yet everyone in the room swore they had heard it. A single drawn-out word embedded in the final burst of noise, one that none of them could later agree upon. Some heard, "Return." Others, "Below." That night, the ticking continued, now faintly audible without the receiver. DuPont's final note for the entry was terse, almost a confession. "The stone is transmitting. Whether from above or beneath, I do not know, but something down here is calling, and now it knows we're listening." Near the tunnel junction, the team uncovered fragments of human bone mixed with quartz sand. Carbon dating decades later would reveal an impossible result over 20,000 years old, long before Egypt's dynastic period began. The discovery came unexpectedly, during what should have been routine clearing work. The tunnel floor near the junction had filled with compacted sediment, pale grey dust, layered with tiny crystals that shimmered under lamplight. The workers expected it to be ordinary collapsed debris. But when one of them struck the surface with his trowel, something pale rolled free, the curved edge of a jawbone, small and brittle. At first, DuPont assumed it was intrusive, a later burial displaced by shifting sand, but as the team dug further, they uncovered more: a partial femur, a rib, and the broken contour of a human skull, all fused with grains of quartz. The bones were not fossilized, yet they carried an unnatural weight and texture, as though infused with mineral dust. What unsettled the men most was the coloration, a faint translucence along the edges, giving the remains an almost glass-like sheen. Duret photographed each fragment, carefully measuring the alignment of the deposit. The bones weren't lying randomly. They formed a rough semicircle around the wall junction, as if deliberately arranged. Beneath them lay a patch of melted stone, smooth and dark. Its surface bubbled as though exposed to extreme heat. Dupont knelt beside it, touching it with a gloved hand. "No burial fire burns this hot," he said quietly. The immediate assumption was that the skeleton belonged to an intruder, someone who had entered the chamber centuries earlier. Yet the quartz content in the surrounding sand told a different story. It wasn't desert sand at all, but crushed crystalline material, the same type of quartz that lined the earlier resonant chambers. Whatever had happened here involved sound, pressure, or heat, not natural decay. Back at camp, Dupont documented every detail and sent the fragments to Cairo for analysis. The report returned weeks later, and its conclusion was so unexpected that it was quietly suppressed. Carbon-14 results placed the remains at roughly 20,400 years old, predating not only Egypt's first civilization, but the very existence of organized settlement along the Nile. The bone matrix contained trace amounts of metallic elements, primarily hematite and magnetite, both materials known to hold residual magnetic alignment. In other words, the bones themselves were magnetized. When Dupont received the report, he wrote in his private log, "The dead here do not decay. They record." He began to wonder whether the quartz-laced sediment acted as a kind of preservation field, not by chemical reaction, but by resonance, freezing organic matter in time. That night, the camp's instruments registered faint electromagnetic fluctuations emanating from the bone crate. When Duret placed a compass near it, the needle drifted toward the box and stayed fixed. Some claimed to hear a low hum from within, a tone so faint it was more felt than heard. Dupont ordered the remains sealed immediately, though not before noting the orientation of the bones on his site map. Their arc pointed directly toward the sealed chamber they had yet to open. He or they were facing something, he wrote. The following morning, the crate containing the bones was gone. No footprints led away from the tent, and the sand outside was undisturbed. Only the faint smell of ozone lingered in the air. In Dupont's next entry, written with a trembling hand, he concluded, these were not intruders, they were witnesses. And whatever they saw, it still lives beneath the quartz. Rows of copper discs lined the walls like decorative shields, but each was aligned at a calculated angle. When flashlights struck one, the beam ricocheted to the next, illuminating the entire chamber at once, a primitive optical system beyond its era. When Dupont first entered the room, he thought the reflections were water flashes of light dancing across the walls like ripples in a pond. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized the gleam came from polished metal, hundreds of circular plates embedded in the stone itself. Each disc was no larger than a man's hand, yet together they formed a seamless web of reflected light, turning the space into a living prism. Duret moved his lantern slightly, and the entire chamber seemed to awaken. Light bounced from mirror to mirror, spiraling upward and downward in perfect sequence. Within seconds, the room glowed evenly, every shadow erased. The alignment was deliberate, a precise optical chain designed to amplify illumination. When one mirror was covered, the brightness dropped instantly, proving that the system relied on uninterrupted reflection. Copper would tarnish in a decade, Hamad noted. These are thousands of years old. How do they still shine? Dupont examined one disc closely. It wasn't pure copper. Traces of tin and arsenic were present, forming a natural alloy resistant to corrosion. But there was something more. The surfaces bore microscopic grooves, curved and patterned like the etchings of a phonograph. Under magnification, the lines seemed to form repeating waveforms too orderly to be random. Duret speculated that they were not merely mirrors, but devices tuned to reflect both light and sound. When he clapped his hands sharply, the echo behaved unnaturally, bouncing between the discs before fading. Each reflection produced a faint harmonic tone, as though the chamber itself was playing a note too low to hear but strong enough to feel. Their bodies vibrated slightly with every movement. Dupont wrote, "The mirrors sing." The floor was different, a mosaic of crushed quartz and hematite that glowed faintly when struck by light. The combination of copper, quartz, and magnetite formed what modern scientists would recognize as a primitive resonance circuit capable of interacting with electromagnetic energy. Yet the concept was inconceivable for a civilization 5 millennia before recorded history. Near the far wall, Hamad discovered an inscription unlike any they had seen. A series of short vertical slashes arranged in repeating sequences. When plotted on paper, the marks corresponded to the same intervals found in musical notation. "It's not writing," Duret murmured. "It's rhythm." As the team documented the pattern, something strange occurred. The ambient hum in the room began to shift, syncing with their voices. Each time they spoke, the tone behind the sound grew louder, aligning to their pitch. Then, when Dupont whispered directly toward one of the mirrors, a thin ray of light flickered between discs, tracing his voice as though sound itself had become visible. The effect vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only silence and the metallic scent of heat. When Duret checked his instruments, the temperature had dropped 3 degrees in under a minute despite the absence of airflow. Before leaving, Dupont took one of the mirrors as a sample, prying it free with care. The moment it detached, the chamber dimmed slightly, as though its balance had been disturbed. Outside, under the desert sun, the disc lost its luster within minutes, its surface dulling to lifeless brown. But when brought near the entrance again, the shine returned, and the faint hum resumed. Dupont's final note for the day was simple but chilling. The mirrors respond to presence. They remember light that is no longer here. Phonograph records recovered from the expedition include a low-frequency hum captured without any known source. When amplified, it formed harmonic patterns similar to chanting. Listeners described the sound as almost human. The recordings were discovered weeks after the expedition ended, packed among the damaged wax cylinders from the deeper tunnels. Most contained faint mechanical noise, static, clicks, and the crackle of old recording gear. But 3 cylinders stood out. When played at normal speed, they emitted a deep, rhythmic vibration that pulsed steadily, like the sound of distant machinery. Slowed down, however, the pattern shifted. The noise revealed tonal intervals and layered harmonics too structured to be random. Duret had originally placed the phonograph near the sealed chamber to test resonance. Yet the grooves captured something continuous, extending far below the threshold of human hearing. When translated into visual spectrograms decades later, the waves formed symmetrical arcs, resembling vowel shapes in human speech. In one section, a faint modulation rose and fell in a cadence unmistakably similar to chanting, not a song, not words, but a rhythmic human-like breath cycling through tones of equal spacing. Dupont described it in his field notes as the sound of breath made by something that does not need to breathe. At the time, the team could not explain how the vibrations were generated. No air current was strong enough to cause resonance, and no natural sound source existed that could sustain such steady frequencies underground. The theory of acoustic interference caused by metallic ore was considered, but the pattern was too consistent, repeating every 52 seconds with mathematical precision. On the 3rd night of testing, Duret claimed to hear the tone with his bare ears, even after the machine stopped turning. The others dismissed it as fatigue. But later that same evening, several men reported a pressure in their heads, a heavy stillness followed by a single, low pulse that seemed to come from the floor. DuPont noted that their lanterns dimmed at the same moment. When the recordings were replayed at double speed, an even stranger detail emerged. The overlapping hums created a harmonic resonance identical to the geometry of the copper mirror chamber above, 12 intervals repeating in a continuous cycle. It was as if the structure itself was emitting sound, each chamber tuned to a frequency that, when combined, formed a complete tonal sequence. Modern analysts comparing the recovered recordings to known acoustic signatures found something extraordinary. The lowest tone matched the Schumann resonance, the natural frequency of the Earth's electromagnetic field. To replicate such precision without instruments would have required knowledge far beyond that of any known ancient civilization. DuPont's final entry on the subject, written in a hurried scrawl, simply read, "The stones are speaking to one another." We have interrupted their conversation. After that night, no further recordings were made. The phonograph was found shattered the next morning, its horn twisted and warped as if compressed by invisible force. And yet, when the recovered cylinder was played one last time years later, a new sound was faintly audible beneath the hum, a single, drawn breath, followed by 3 quiet words in a language no one could identify. In a granite alcove, the team found a stone coffin far older than any in the Memphis necropolis. It was empty, except for a fine layer of metallic dust. Analysis decades later showed it to be pure hematite. Magnetized, the sarcophagus lay recessed into the western wall of the lowest chamber, half buried under centuries of compressed sediment. Its lid was perfectly fitted, edges sealed with a resine-like compound that had hardened into black glass. There were no inscriptions, no symbols of kingship, and no trace of paint or decoration. The simplicity made it all the more unsettling, a precision-cut granite box in a place that should not have existed. When DuPont and his men pried the lid open, a hiss escaped, followed by a metallic scent that burned faintly in their throats. Inside was no body, no linen, no funerary relics, only a thin layer of reddish-grey dust that shimmered under the lamplight. Duret dipped a glass vial into the residue. The particles clung to the sides as though alive, shifting and aligning with one another in delicate magnetic patterns. At first, they assumed it was oxidized iron or ancient pigment. But when examined under magnification, the grains appeared uniform crystalline, sharp-edged, metallic in luster. Even stranger, when brought near a compass, the needle trembled and pointed not north but directly toward the sarcophagus. DuPont noted the anomaly, writing, "The coffin itself is magnetic. It responds to presence, not polarity. Measurements confirmed it." A field of weak but stable magnetism surrounded the coffin, extending nearly 2 meters outward. Within that boundary, metal tools vibrated faintly, as if responding to a pulse. The granite, once thought inert, contained streaks of magnetite and quartz, both piezoelectric materials capable of producing current under stress. It was as if the sarcophagus had been built to channel or contain energy, not a body. Hamad searched the alcove for inscriptions, but found none, only 6 shallow grooves carved into the surrounding walls. Their orientation aligned precisely with the Earth's magnetic declination, as it would have appeared around 20,000 years ago, long before dynastic Egypt. "They positioned this for the planet's field, not for ritual," he whispered. When DuPont attempted to lift the sarcophagus lid completely, the lantern flames flickered and went out. A low resonance filled the air, not loud, but heavy, pressing against the chest like the vibration of a distant engine. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound vanished, and all light returned. The metallic dust was later sent to Cairo, where laboratory analysis confirmed it as nearly pure hematite with an unusually high magnetic retention. But the results contained one more disturbing detail: trace isotopes of iridium and nickel, elements typically found in meteorite material. The conclusion was unspoken but clear. The hematite was not of terrestrial origin. DuPont's final notes were written the same night, his handwriting uneven. If this was a coffin, its occupant was not buried. The box is empty because it was never meant to hold the dead, it was meant to charge the stone itself. The next morning, when the team returned to photograph the chamber, the sarcophagus lid was back in place. None of the men admitted to sealing it. Assistant engineer Julian Worth reportedly collapsed without warning while surveying the chamber. His pulse slowed dramatically, though he recovered minutes later with no memory of the episode, only the sensation of hearing metal breathing. It happened shortly after sunrise, on the third day of continuous measurement within the lower complex. The air had grown increasingly dense, charged with static, and the instruments were erratic, compasses twitching, altimeters dropping without reason. Worth had been mapping magnetic gradients near the unearthed sarcophagus when he suddenly staggered backward and fell to the floor, his equipment scattered around him, the metal tools vibrating audibly for several seconds after they hit the ground. Duret was the first to reach him. Worth's eyes were open, his pupils constricted, but his breathing was shallow and irregular. DuPont noted his pulse at 30 beats per minute, dangerously low. They moved him to the upper passage, where within minutes his vitals returned to normal. Yet he remained dazed, repeating a single phrase in German. Der Stein atmet, the stone breathes. When questioned later, Worth could recall nothing of his collapse, only that he had been tracing a faint resonance in the granite wall when the sound began moving. He described it as a low metallic inhalation, as though the stone itself was drawing air. No one else had heard it, yet every man admitted to feeling pressure in their ears just before the incident, the same sensation one feels when descending in altitude. The instruments confirmed a rapid shift in atmospheric pressure, localized entirely within the chamber. The barometer dropped 3 millibars in under 10 seconds, then stabilized, without any change outside. It was as though the room had exhaled, then inhaled again. The event repeated twice more over the next hour, each time preceded by a faint pulse on the magnetometer. DuPont ordered a temporary evacuation, fearing toxic gases, but the air tested clean. The only anomaly was temperature, a 2-degree drop each time the pressure wave occurred, followed by a slow return to baseline. When Worth finally rejoined the team that evening, he appeared physically well. Something in his demeanor had changed. He avoided the lower tunnels entirely, claiming that the walls listened when he passed. That night, he woke abruptly in his tent, gasping. The others found him sitting upright, staring toward the excavation site. "It's below us," he whispered, not sound rhythm. The next morning, he showed DuPont a hastily drawn graph, a sinusoidal curve repeating every 48 seconds, sketched from memory. It matched the timing of the Morse-like clicks recorded days earlier. DuPont's notes from that day were brief but chilling. The chamber is active again. The magnetic field pulses coincide with respiration intervals. Worth's collapse may not have been medical, it was synchronization. When the expedition's physician examined him later, Worth's heartbeat was measured at precisely 48 beats per minute, perfectly aligned with the interval DuPont had recorded. The rhythm persisted for 3 days before returning to normal. In his final statement before leaving Dahshur, Worth wrote one line that was later found scrawled in his field book. Ink smeared as if written during a tremor. "I heard it inhale. I do not want to hear it exhale." The readings taken in Dahshur matched those later recorded near the magnetic stone of Abu Rawash. The realization came months after the expedition had ended, when DuPont's surviving data was compared with an unrelated survey conducted by the French-Egyptian Geological Mission northwest of Giza. The Abu Rawash Ridge, long dismissed as a ruined pyramid site, contained a solitary basalt slab known locally as Al-Hajar al-Magnatisi, the magnetic stone. Instruments placed near it behaved much like those DuPont had described at Dahshur. Compasses spun aimlessly, watches slowed, and weak electrical charges flickered across the ground without visible cause. At first, the similarities were dismissed as coincidence, both sites rich in ferrous rock and quartz. But when the Dahshur and Abu Rawash magnetometer data were overlaid decades later, the correlation was undeniable. The oscillations, recorded independently and separated by nearly 80 kilometers, shared an identical periodic frequency of 0.83 Hz, a pulse too regular to be geological. Geophysicist Henri Vallon, reviewing the findings in 1963, noted that both anomalies aligned along a perfect geodesic arc stretching from Dahshur through Abu Rawash and ending in the Mediterranean. "It is not random," he wrote. "It is a circuit." The possibility that the two sites were components of a larger terrestrial system, an ancient network harnessing Earth's magnetic field, began to take shape. DuPont himself had hinted at such a theory in his final notes. He speculated that the electromagnetic disturbances within the lower chambers might not have been self-contained but part of a broader field. "If the signal we recorded is not local," he wrote, "then it may be calling to another stone." At the time, the idea seemed absurd, but the Abu Rawash readings decades later revived interest in his forgotten journals. The magnetic stone itself was unlike anything else in Egypt. Roughly 2 meters in length, its surface was smooth, dark, and slightly concave, as though shaped by immense heat. When metal tools approached it, they vibrated faintly. When struck with a hammer, it emitted a low, sustained tone, audible for nearly half a minute. Magnetic mapping revealed that the slab's north-south alignment deviated exactly 11 degrees, the same offset found in the orientation of Dahshur's lower passage. Even more curious was what lay beneath. Ground-penetrating radar in the early 2000s revealed voids extending downward in a spiral formation eerily similar to the geometry described in DuPont's maps. It was as if Abu Rawash were a mirror of Dahshur, a northern twin built to resonate with the same frequencies. The hematite dust from the Dahshur sarcophagus and the basalt fragments from Abu Rawash were later compared using X-ray diffraction. Both samples contained traces of nickel and iridium rare elements consistent with meteorite impact material. The conclusion was inescapable. The builders had sourced material from the same extraterrestrial origin, possibly from a single ancient strike field scattered across the Nile basin. DuPont never lived to see the connection confirmed, yet his last surviving note, preserved in the archives of the Cairo Museum, reads like prophecy. "There is a rhythm beneath this land, one stone answers another." Dahshur hums, and Abu Rawash listens. Modern researchers still measure the 0.83 Hz signal along the arc between the two sites. It rises and falls with the solar wind, fluctuating as though the ancient mechanism beneath the sand still breathes just slower now, like the fading heartbeat of a machine that refuses to die. Beyond the sarcophagus room, the expedition uncovered a vertical shaft descending beyond the limits of their rope. Stones dropped into it took 12 seconds before impact, a depth of over 700 feet. No further exploration was attempted that day. The discovery came quietly, almost by accident. While examining the floor seams behind the sarcophagus alcove, Abbas noticed a faint draft of air escaping through a narrow slit between the stones. When the team pried the section loose, the temperature plummeted. The beam from their lanterns revealed a perfectly circular opening cut directly into the bedrock, a shaft so black it seemed to swallow light. The edges were smooth, the circumference precise, and the air rising from below was unnaturally cold. DuPont tested its depth with a weighted line, but the rope ran out long before reaching bottom. They dropped to stone, and after 12 long seconds came the faintest echo, a hollow metallic thud rather than the dull strike of rock. "That isn't Earth down there," Durrett murmured. "It's something solid." Measurements suggested a vertical depth exceeding 200 meters. Impossible to excavate by hand, especially in such perfect symmetry. The walls bore faint, spiraling grooves, visible only when light struck them from an angle. Each groove descended in a clockwise pattern, the same direction as the acoustic resonance measured earlier in the chamber above. It was as though the shaft had been drilled rather than carved, bored into the planet's crust with an unknown precision. The draft carried a faint scent, not decay, not moisture, but metallic ozone, like air after a lightning strike. DuPont ordered the men to step back, worried about toxic gas, but tests showed the air composition nearly identical to surface readings. The phenomenon defied logic. Hamad proposed that the shaft might have been an ancient ventilation tunnel, but DuPont disagreed. "Ventilation for what?" he asked. "There's no structure below, at least, none we've found." He theorized that the pit was part of the same magnetic network connecting Dahshur and Abu Rawash, a conduit linking to something beneath the desert, deeper than any tomb. That night, DuPont recorded the air pressure and magnetic field near the rim. Both fluctuated in steady cycles every 48 seconds, perfectly matching the resonance patterns heard through the phonograph weeks earlier. The shaft, it seemed, was not dormant. It pulsed. On the morning of March 4th, the team prepared for a preliminary descent. Worth, still shaken from his earlier collapse, refused to participate, claiming he could feel the vibrations even from camp. The others assembled the winch and reinforced cables. But just before lowering the first line, the earth beneath the rim trembled slightly. Not an earthquake, but a deep rhythmic throb that reverberated through the granite walls. The air grew dense, heavy, humming softly like a distant engine. DuPont froze, realizing the pitch matched the breathing rhythm Worth had described. The vibrations intensified, and small pebbles began to dance across the stone. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The shaft exhaled one final gust of freezing air, strong enough to snuff out every lantern. When the light returned, a fine film of red dust coated the rim hematite, the same metallic residue found in the sarcophagus. DuPont wrote one final entry before sealing the passage. "The shaft is not a tunnel. It is a mouth. And it listens." No further descent was attempted. The next morning, sand had already begun to drift across the entrance, as though the desert itself had decided it should remain buried. Blueprints found in the expedition archive show an improvised winch built from camera tripods and timber. What they found below was never fully recorded. 2 pages of the log were torn out. The device itself was crude but functional, a wooden tripod reinforced with brass fittings from the photographic equipment, anchored by sandbags and weighted cables. DuPont, unwilling to risk the loss of the expedition's core instruments, ordered a slow manual descent using a hand-cranked pulley system. The winch creaked under tension, the sound echoing down the shaft like a heartbeat. The volunteers were Duret, Abbas, and a field assistant named René Courbet, each tethered to a separate line, carrying carbide lamps, a camera, and a single phonograph cylinder for audio notes. According to the surviving entries, the first 20 meters passed without issue. The walls of the shaft were perfectly smooth, the spiraling grooves continuing downward in a consistent pattern. The air pressure increased gradually, and the lamps began to flicker, their flames bowing inward as if drawn toward the darkness below. At 60 meters, the rope vibrated faintly, transmitting a steady pulse from beneath, not mechanical, but organic, rhythmic. Duret's voice, faintly recorded on the recovered phonograph, described a low red shimmer reflecting off the rock far below. "It looks metallic," he said. "Not light, more like heat." The others confirmed the observation, noting a faint vibration rising through the walls. Then, abruptly, the recording cut to static. What happened next survives only in fragments. DuPont's personal log, written in tight script, recounts how the ropes went slack for several seconds before drawing taut again, as if the men had stepped onto a ledge or platform. Courbet shouted something indistinct. Then, Dupont wrote, a flash of light from below orange, brief, soundless. Moments later, all 3 lines began to sway violently. The winch frame groaned. The crew above struggled to stabilize it, but one of the tripod legs split, throwing sparks as the metal fittings tore loose. The men were hauled up one by one over the course of an hour. Abbas came first. Barely conscious, his eyes bloodshot and skin coated with metallic dust. Courbet followed, disoriented and trembling. Duret was last pale, silent, refusing to speak. His journal from that day contains only one unfinished sentence. There was movement inside the stone, not vibration, not life. But the rest of the page was torn away. The missing log pages correspond to this same period, roughly 40 minutes, unaccounted for in the expedition's timeline. What remains of Dupont's notes suggests something was retrieved from below. Sample sealed, followed by storage suspended due to risk of discharge. No such artifact was ever found among the surviving inventory. When questioned later in Cairo, Dupont refused to elaborate. He simply said, "We reached the end of the shaft, and it reached back. After that, the site was sealed permanently under government order. The winch assembly, the ropes, and the remaining equipment were left in place, buried under the first wave of sand that reclaimed the pit. The only surviving clue to what they may have seen came from a single, undated photograph, a blurred exposure showing 3 figures standing before a curved metallic surface deep underground. The bottom of the frame was marked in Dupont's handwriting, not reflection, door. At the bottom lay a black pool of perfectly still water. No ripples, no smell, no insects. When light touched it, the surface reflected not the ceiling, but an image resembling a night sky. The men first saw it by accident, their lantern beams falling across the surface as they stepped off the final rung of rope. The liquid, if it was liquid at all, looked more like polished glass than water. Their reflections were absent. Instead, stars shimmered beneath their feet, arranged in constellations they didn't recognize. The sight was so disorienting that Abbas nearly dropped his lamp, mistaking the reflection for open space. "It's not a pool," Duret whispered. "It's a window." Dupont ordered them to stay back while he tested the perimeter. The basin was roughly 10 meters across, carved perfectly circular, its rim seamless with the surrounding floor. When a small pebble was dropped in, it vanished without sound or ripple, as though absorbed. Moments later, faint waves of light spread across the surface like auroras rippling through deep space. The air near the pool felt wrong. Every breath carried a metallic taste, and the lanterns dimmed the closer they came to the edge. Instruments refused to function, compasses spun, watches stalled, and even Duret's phonograph recorded nothing but an endless, low hum. The pool seemed to drain energy from everything around it. Abbas dipped a wooden rod into the surface. It entered smoothly, but emerged dry, the end unburned and cool to the touch. Whatever composed the pool wasn't water or oil. Dupont theorized it might be a film of condensed mineral or a mirage caused by electromagnetic fields. Yet when he knelt to inspect it more closely, his shadow disappeared from the ground, replaced by another, deeper outline stretching toward the pool itself. Then, the image shifted. What had looked like a star field began to move, constellations bending and reforming into spirals, pulsing with faint color. The shapes weren't random. They mirrored diagrams Dupont had recorded from the hieratic inscriptions near the sealed gate. The eye beneath the sunday. It was as if the pool displayed a map, not of the sky above, but of something below an inverted firmament hidden within the earth. Duret attempted a long exposure photograph. When developed, the plate showed no stars, no reflection, only a single luminous ring expanding outward from a central point, resembling an iris. The faint outline of a human silhouette stood at its center, though no one had been near the pool during the exposure. Fearing contamination, DuPont ordered samples collected, but nothing could be contained. Any vial brought near the surface lost pressure and shattered. Even the metallic dust on their clothing began to vibrate faintly in sync with the pool's light. Before retreating, DuPont marked coordinates and noted one final phenomenon. When the lanterns were extinguished, the pool emitted its own dim glow, a moving pattern of starlight beneath absolute silence. He described it as the illusion of infinity contained within 10 meters of stone. That night, back at camp, the men compared sketches and discovered something impossible. The pattern of stars they'd seen matched the position of constellations, as they would have appeared from Egypt, not in the present day, but nearly 20,000 years ago. DuPont's last entry for the descent ended with one line, underlined twice. The pool shows the world before memory. The team's magnetic compass floated on the pool's surface. It did not point north, it spun slowly, aligning to the chamber's walls instead, as though obeying an artificial magnetic field. DuPont had placed the compass there as a simple experiment. He wanted to determine whether the mysterious pool had any measurable field or current. But the moment the brass case touched the surface, it stopped behaving like an instrument at all. Instead of sinking, it hovered, resting weightlessly on the dark film as if buoyed by invisible tension. The needle began to move not erratically, but with deliberate precision, tracing a slow circle before locking toward the western wall. Seconds later, it shifted again, now pointing toward the eastern edge, where the carvings on the granite faintly glimmered in the reflected light. "Something's controlling it," Durrett whispered, crouching beside the pool. "It's not following north. It's following the chamber." DuPont recorded the compass's movement by stopwatch. Every rotation took exactly 48 seconds, the same interval as the vibrations recorded in the shaft above. The synchronization was too precise to be coincidence. "It's cycling," DuPont said quietly. "Whatever energy runs through this place, it pulses." As they watched, faint concentric ripples began to appear around the compass, though nothing had touched the surface. The waves moved outward in perfect rhythm with the spinning needle. Then, without warning, the compass drifted away from the center of the pool, sliding smoothly across the surface as if carried by a current no one could feel. When it reached the far edge, it stopped, needle locked directly toward one of the copper discs embedded in the wall above. Abbas moved to retrieve it, but DuPont held him back. "Wait," he said. "It's responding to the mirrors." He shone his lantern toward the copper array. The reflected beam struck the pool, and immediately the compass spun again, this time reversing direction. The ripples quickened, forming a faint spiral pattern that deepened at the center until the water darkened to absolute black. For several seconds, the air in the chamber seemed to hum a low resonance that vibrated in their teeth. Then, just as abruptly, the compass stopped. The surface went still. When DuPont reached for it, the instrument was ice cold, and its needle frozen in place. The brass casing was coated in a thin film of metallic residue hematite. Again, but the magnetism had vanished. It no longer responded to north at all. Durrett suggested that the pool was generating a rotating magnetic field, similar to an electrical dynamo. "But if that's true," DuPont replied, "then something must be powering it, something still working after millennia." Later analysis of DuPont's notes showed that the compass's orientation at its final position matched the line of magnetic alignment between Dahshur and Abu Rawash, the same arc already identified in earlier readings. It was as if the pool were a receiver, resonating to that same deep planetary pulse. That night, DuPont sealed the compass in a lead-lined case. Hours later, when the team returned to the tent, they found the case warm to the touch and faintly vibrating, the same rhythm repeating every 48 seconds. In his final entry for the day, DuPont wrote only one line: "The compass has found north, but not of this earth." After 16 hours underground, the team returned pale, disoriented, and unable to recall sections of the descent. Their watches disagreed by several minutes, though they had all been synchronized beforehand. When they finally emerged from the shaft, the first light of dawn had already spread across the dunes. The men blinked against the glare, their movements slow and uncertain, as though the climb had drained something deeper than strength. Dupont was the last to surface. He said nothing at first, only stared at the horizon, as if trying to recognize where he was. His hands trembled when he finally removed his gloves. The skin beneath was coated in a faint grey dust that shimmered faintly in the morning sunday. Duret noted that their voices carried strangely in the open air. Muted, hollow, as though the desert itself were absorbing the sound. When the men tried to speak about what they'd seen below, each account contradicted the other. Abbas remembered the descent lasting no more than 4 hours. Courbet swore it had been twice that. Dupont's notes, written by lantern light, showed gaps, long stretches of missing time between entries. The watches told the same story. All had been synchronized before the descent, yet upon resurfacing, each one read differently. Duret's ran 8 minutes slow. Abbas's had stopped entirely. Dupont's had somehow gained 3 minutes. Even more baffling was that their chronometers, when recalibrated, refused to stay aligned, drifting by seconds every hour, as if time itself had bent unevenly around them. Back at camp, the men began exhibiting symptoms of disorientation. Simple questions, what hour they had descended, who had gone first, sparked confusion and argument. Several complained of a pressure behind the eyes, followed by brief flashes of light when they closed them, as if staring into the afterimage of a camera bulb. Dupont reported hearing a faint rhythmic pulse in his ears that persisted long after they left the site. Hamad, the expedition's physician, noted physiological irregularities. Lowered heart rates, minor loss of coordination, and in Dupont's case, a measurable change in pupil dilation that didn't respond properly to light. It was as though their circadian rhythms had been reset, not fatigued, but misaligned, as if they had returned from a place where time moved differently. Later that evening, Dupont attempted to review the phonograph recordings from below. Every cylinder had warped, the wax softened and reformed as if exposed to heat, though none of the lamps had burned hot enough to cause it. The grooves were smoothed over, leaving only faint concentric lines. When one was played, the horn emitted a low, slow thrum that made the tent walls vibrate. The sound matched the same 0.83 Hz frequency recorded between Dahshur and Abu Rawash. None of the men slept that night. Duret reported seeing flickers of movement beyond the perimeter lights, shapes that shimmered like reflections in black water. Abbas refused to stay near the excavation, saying the ground breathed when the wind passed over it. By morning, Dupont's field journal ended abruptly. His final note read, "We returned to the surface, but not to the same hour. The desert's shadow moves beneath the sand, and it remembers who crossed it." Weeks later, the Egyptian Antiquities Authority classified the findings. Official statements described the expedition as inconclusive. The site was sealed with reinforced limestone and marked unsafe due to instability. The official record that followed was clinical and brief, a single-page summary filed under Geological Survey, Dahshur, 1924. It made no mention of magnetic disturbances, the sarcophagus, or the shaft that descended hundreds of feet into the bedrock. Instead, it referred vaguely to structural anomalies and unverified observations of subterranean voids. For decades, the file remained untouched in the Cairo archives, its more detailed appendices quietly removed. Only Dupont's personal journal, rediscovered in 1968, hinted at the full extent of what had been found. Within a week of the team's return, officials from the Antiquities Authority arrived at the camp. They were accompanied by British advisors from the Geological Mission, and several armed guards, a presence unusual for an archaeological closure. Dupont was questioned for nearly 10 hours about his measurements, his samples, and especially the magnetic data. His equipment was confiscated, the phonograph cylinders taken for technical review. When he asked for copies of his own reports, he was told they were being transferred to the Ministry of Public Works. He never saw them again. Hamad later wrote that Dupont's mental state deteriorated quickly after the interrogation. He became withdrawn, refusing to speak of the lower chambers. His final days in Cairo were spent sketching the site layout from memory, redrawing the spiral descent again and again, each version slightly altered, as if the structure itself kept changing in his mind. The official sealing of the site took less than 3 days. Workers poured tons of limestone and gypsum into the shaft, covering the surface with a solid cap nearly 2 meters thick. The order was issued not under the Antiquities Department, but by the Ministry of Defense, a fact noted by later historians as highly unusual. The reasoning cited geological instability. Yet no tremors were ever recorded in the Dahshur region that year. Rumors spread quickly among local workers. Some claimed that before the final closure, strange lights had been seen near the excavation at night, faint red glows flickering through the sand. Others swore they heard vibrations beneath the ground, long after the shaft was sealed, like the hum of a buried engine. The guards stationed on site dismissed it as superstition, though one was later transferred after refusing to patrol near the old pit. By the 1932, the Dahshur excavation vanished from official reports entirely. No subsequent permits were granted, and later maps of the area omitted any record of the 1924 expedition. The archives listed Dupont as having retired due to illness in 1925. He died in seclusion the following year, his journals left to a private collector in Lyon. It wasn't until decades later that portions of the sealed correspondence between the Antiquities Authority and the British Embassy were declassified. One letter, dated October 1924, contained a single chilling line typed beneath the formal closure notice. The site at Dahshur exhibits ongoing electromagnetic activity inconsistent with natural origin. Recommend permanent containment. Dupont's last surviving note, written days before his death, reads simply, "They close the shaft, but the pulse continues. The stone does not sleep." When the crates reached Cairo, several catalogued items, including a sample of the black stone and the copper mirrors, were missing. The manifests remain incomplete to this day. The disappearance was first noticed during the transfer from the railway depot to the Antiquities Authority's storage vaults. Dupont's original inventory listed 47 catalogued artifacts: fragments of basalt beams, hematite dust, 2 copper discs, a sealed vial of quartz sand, and several photographic plates. By the time the shipment was opened for inspection, 8 of those entries had vanished without trace. No customs seals were broken, no signs of tampering were recorded. The crates appeared untouched. The missing items weren't random. Every object connected to magnetic or reflective phenomena was gone. The sample of the singing stone from the Unmapped Gallery, the mirror taken from the copper-lined chamber, and even Dupont's compass, the one that had spun on the reflection pool, were absent. Only the more mundane items remained: fragments of limestone, pottery shards, and handwritten notes. To the inspectors, it seemed as though someone had selectively removed anything that could substantiate Dupont's stranger claims. An internal memo from 1925, later uncovered in the British Museum archives, confirmed that the artifacts had indeed arrived intact. A clerk named Mahmoud el-Halabi signed for their receipt and noted a faint electrical odour when the crates were opened, a detail omitted from the final report. Within days, el-Halabi reportedly fell ill, suffering from dizziness and recurring tinnitus. His symptoms mirrored those described by the Dahshur team weeks earlier. He was transferred shortly after and never mentioned again in departmental records. Dupont, still in Cairo at the time, demanded an inquiry. The Antiquities Authority dismissed his accusations as stress-induced, citing his deteriorating health and increasingly speculative correspondence. His letters to the Ministry of Public Works went unanswered, and his final telegram to Paris simply read, "Objects gone. No record. Do not pursue." Years later, scattered references to the missing pieces began to surface in unrelated collections. A British naval officer claimed to have seen a copper disc that sang when struck, displayed privately at a London salon in 1931. A fragment of dark magnetized stone matching Dupont's description was registered at the Louvre under an anonymous donation in 1935, but its provenance was quickly redacted. Even the vial of quartz sand reappeared briefly in a German mineral catalogue before vanishing once more during wartime transport. Each reappearance carried the same peculiar note: unexplained degradation of nearby instruments, static interference, and faint vibration when handled. Modern metallurgical analysis of one surviving copper shard, recovered from a private estate in Lyon, confirmed the presence of alloys unknown to ancient metallurgy and microscopic grooves resembling those found on phonograph records. It appeared the objects had been designed to capture not just light, but sound, or perhaps something beyond either. By the time the Dahshur file was reopened in 1969, nearly every physical trace of the expedition's discoveries was gone. Only Dupont's surviving papers and one blurred photograph remained as evidence. The photograph showed a single copper mirror resting on a packing cloth, its surface dark and perfectly smooth. When enhanced decades later, faint symbols became visible reflected across its face. Symbols that were not carved onto the mirror itself, but seemed to float just above it, suspended like a memory of light. The final note, appended to the file, came from a curator at the Egyptian Museum in 1971. Inventory closed. Remaining artifacts show residual magnetism. Recommend no further handling. Nearly half a century later, a joint Franco-Egyptian team reopened the shaft using new ground-penetrating radar. They confirmed cavities beneath the old chambers, spaces extending at least another 300 meters down. The 1971 expedition began quietly, conducted under the guise of a structural stability survey. Decades of sandstorms had buried the old Dahshur site entirely, concealing even the limestone cap that had sealed Dupont's shaft. When the new team arrived, they expected little more than collapsed tunnels. Instead, the instruments began to register anomalies before excavation had even begun. Magnetic distortions and low-frequency vibrations emanating from the same coordinates Dupont had recorded in 1924. Lead engineer François Lenoir described the readings as unnaturally coherent. The radar didn't just detect voids, it revealed symmetrical architecture, descending in perfect spirals far beyond the map chambers. The deeper reflections suggested hollows reinforced by dense material, denser even than basalt. One geophysicist noted that the radar pulses returned with echo patterns identical to polished metal. Within weeks, the shaft was reopened using mechanical drills. The limestone plug, though reinforced, had fractured cleanly, almost as if something below had pushed upward. Beneath it, the old tunnel remained perfectly preserved, the air cool and sterile. The team expected collapsed stone instead. They found smooth granite walls still bearing Dupont's original chalk markings, faded but intact. Even the tripod legs of the 1924 winch stood upright, coated in a thin layer of hematite dust. At 60 meters, new boreholes confirmed the existence of deeper cavities. The radar mapped a descending helix, a spiral core extending another 300 meters into the bedrock. Lenoir, who had studied electromagnetic anomalies during prior research near Abu Rawash, immediately recognized the pattern, a continuation of the same geodesic alignment. linking the two sites. The implication was staggering that Dahshur and Abu Rawash were not separate structures, but parts of a single subterranean complex, connected by geometry and field resonance. The team deployed seismic sensors to probe the lower chambers. The results confounded them. The echoes returned rhythmic intervals, almost like mechanical repetition, a consistent pulse every 48 seconds, identical to the frequencies DuPont's instruments had recorded nearly half a century earlier. The phenomenon persisted, even when equipment was shut down. "It's not noise," Lenoir wrote. "It's response." Attempts to drill further were abandoned after the first borehole struck an unknown material at 284 meters, metallic in composition, smooth and impenetrable to standard bits. When struck with a sonic hammer, the sound did not resonate like stone. It rang, deep and hollow, as though the drill had contacted the surface of a vast chamber or shell. The Egyptian Antiquities Authority halted the dig days later. Officially, the reason was safety, structural instability, risk of collapse. Unofficially, the research team was ordered to surrender all seismic and magnetic data. The archives show that 6 reels of magnetic tape were logged that week. Only 4 remain today. Before departing, Lenoir wrote one final note in his field book. DuPont was right. The descent is not vertical, it folds. The signal comes from below, but not from depth from beneath time itself. The shaft was resealed on the 12th of June 1971. No subsequent expedition has been granted permission to reopen it. Yet locals still report that on windless nights, the sand over Dahshur hums faintly, pulsing every 48 seconds, like the heartbeat of something buried, waiting to wake. Acoustic tests revealed the subterranean architecture formed harmonic nodes at precise intervals, similar to standing sound waves. The pattern matched ratios found in the Great Pyramid's inner chambers. The discovery was made almost by accident. During the 1971 survey's second phase, researchers deployed portable sonic transducers to test the stability of the bedrock. Instead of chaotic echoes, they received structured reflections, a repeating resonance that strengthened at exact distances down the shaft. The nodes occurred every 26.4 meters, forming a precise harmonic progression. When the data was graphed, the resulting wave pattern was identical to the acoustic frequency model of the King's Chamber in Giza. Lead acoustician Dr. Alain Moreau described the result as a resonance designed, not accidental. He demonstrated how each chamber and corridor responded to a specific tone, and how the frequencies interlocked like notes in a chord. The entire subterranean network behaved as a vast instrument, one capable of sustaining and amplifying vibration across its structure. If struck, he wrote, the site would sing. Further experiments confirmed that the harmonics were not geological. When sound was introduced at precise frequencies around 110 Hz and its octaves, the walls themselves began to tremble faintly, emitting overtones in mathematical harmony with one another. The air pressure oscillated visibly, rippling the sand on the floor. The deeper frequencies appeared to travel not just through the rock, but around it, bending through the subterranean geometry as if guided by unseen conduits. Comparative analysis with the Great Pyramid's internal dimensions revealed astonishing alignment. The spacing between the Dahshur nodes mirrored the proportions of the Grand Gallery and King's Chamber, scaled downward by a consistent factor of 3. Even the frequency response matched ancient Egyptian musical ratios, known from reconstructed instruments, particularly the Sikhem flutes and early stringed lyres. The implication was impossible to ignore. The architecture itself embodied harmonic principles known to their builders, principles that modern science would only rediscover millennia later. Moreau theorized the structures were designed to interact with natural resonances of the Earth's electromagnetic field, particularly the Schumann frequency, which oscillates near 8 Hz. When adjusted for the depth and density of Dahshur's granite, the harmonics aligned almost perfectly. "The complex is not simply a tomb," he noted. "It is a resonant cavity, a machine tuned to the planet itself." Unpublished notes from the team's private correspondence suggested they tested this idea further. By introducing synchronized tones through portable transducers, they recorded faint electromagnetic spikes emanating from the deepest mapped node. These signals repeated at exact intervals of 48 seconds, the same temporal rhythm first logged by DuPont in 1924. The deeper they measured, the stronger the signal became. However, when the team attempted to replicate the test a second time, their instruments abruptly failed. The recording reels captured only distortion, a dense, low-frequency pulse that caused several of the team members to feel momentarily disoriented. One described the sensation as standing inside a vibration that listens back. Within days, the Antiquities Authority ordered the acoustic experiments halted, citing potential for structural compromise. All sonic data was classified and removed from Cairo under diplomatic escort. Still, fragments of the research survived in personal notes. The final entry from Moreau's field journal, recovered years later, reads, "The nodes are harmonic mirrors. Sound does not echo here, it folds." And at the lowest point, something answers the tone. Core samples from the lower chamber showed microcrystalline structures partially magnetized, impossible for natural granite. Some physicists proposed piezoelectric effects used to store or transmit energy. The samples were taken discreetly in early 1972, just months after the official closure of the Dahshur site. Two French geophysicists and an Egyptian materials expert drilled small precision cores from the inner walls of the lowest mapped cavity before the passage was resealed. The intent was simple: to determine the origin of the black granite beams that defied classification in earlier surveys. What they found instead defied geology itself. Under polarized microscopy, the granite's internal lattice revealed perfect orientation of quartz and feldspar crystals, an alignment so precise it appeared to have been engineered. The quartz grains were fused along their axes, forming conductive pathways that extended in parallel lines, like microscopic wires embedded in stone. When exposed to vibration, the samples emitted faint electric potentials measurable on modern instruments. The granite was, in effect, a solid-state conductor, a material behaving like a battery that had never been discharged. Dr. Alain Moreau, still attached to the project at the time, called it deliberate crystallography. He demonstrated that when mechanical pressure or acoustic energy was applied, the samples produced measurable voltages, confirming the piezoelectric hypothesis. Yet what startled him most was that even without stimulation, the granite emitted a weak but continuous current, as if the stone retained residual charge from an unknown source. Magnetic scanning showed a symmetrical polarity distribution through the samples, something never found in natural formations. The magnetic field reversed precisely every 12.6 millimeters, an interval matching the harmonic spacing mapped in the chamber's resonance nodes. It was as though the stone itself had been tuned, each crystalline layer acting as a resonant capacitor. One of the researchers, physicist Jean Levine, speculated that the material functioned as part of a larger network, a structural battery, storing mechanical or electromagnetic energy within its geometry. "The chamber is not passive," he wrote. "It's an energy reservoir, recharging through vibration." To test the theory, they applied controlled sound waves at 110 Hz, the same fundamental frequency found throughout the site. The readings spiked instantly. Voltage increased tenfold, magnetic alignment sharpened, and a low hum became audible through the sensors. The granite responded as though awakened by tone, but the effect quickly became unstable. Instruments overloaded, and the sound field began to oscillate unpredictably. The hum deepened until it resonated through the entire structure, shaking dust loose from the ceiling. the test was halted immediately. When they rechecked the samples, the current had vanished. The granite had gone inert, as if whatever mechanism within it had discharged completely. That night, the monitoring station still recorded faint magnetic fluctuations coming from the sealed shaft, a pulse repeating at exact intervals of 48 seconds. When the team attempted to repeat the experiment days later, the readings never returned. The results were quietly removed from the official report, replaced with a single sentence citing electrical interference. The surviving cores were divided among institutions, one sent to Paris, another to Cairo, and a third to a private laboratory in Geneva. Years later, when the Paris sample was briefly re-examined, technicians found the quartz structure subtly altered. The grains had shifted alignment, as though the stone had relaxed after decades of tension, like a discharged capacitor, one noted. Moreau's final entry in his research log captured the unease that never left him. The builders didn't just carve stone, they programmed it, and the granite still remembers the signal. Geiger counters registered faint but steady emissions. Around the sarcophagus site, readings too high for background radiation, yet too low to suggest contamination. The source remains unknown. The anomaly was discovered during the final phase of the 1971-72 survey, when new radiation detectors were introduced to monitor mineral composition in the lower chambers. At first, the readings appeared trivial minor spikes consistent with trace uranium in granite. But as the instruments were left to run overnight, a pattern emerged. The radiation fluctuated in precise rhythmic intervals, rising and falling every 48 seconds. The same rhythm had already been observed in the site's magnetic and acoustic data. The emissions were weak, barely a fraction of a microsievert, yet unmistakably artificial in behavior. Instead of decaying randomly, as natural radiation would, they pulsed in harmonic waves. It was as though something beneath the sarcophagus was breathing, wrote Dr. François Lenoir in his field log. The detectors recorded inhalation and exhalation in light. The team recalibrated the devices to rule out interference. Yet every instrument confirmed the same periodic signal, strongest directly above the granite box, and diminishing outward in concentric circles. Even after power was cut to all equipment, the detectors continued to tick in perfect synchrony, as if responding to an internal metronome. When one counter was moved outside the chamber, the effect ceased entirely. The radiation seemed bound to the stone itself. Chemical analysis of the surrounding rock revealed no radioactive isotopes. The granite was clean, its composition identical to non-radiating samples from other pyramids. Even the hematite dust scattered across the floor emitted no detectable energy on its own. The radiation existed only in the air, within a 3-meter radius of the sarcophagus. Forming an invisible sphere of weak, rhythmic light, physicists brought in from Cairo proposed an atmospheric explanation. Static discharge caused by piezoelectric effects in the quartz-rich rock. But this could not account for the consistency of the pulse. Static should flicker, not breathe. Moreau, who had witnessed the same pattern in his acoustic experiments, suspected something deeper, an interaction between magnetism, sound, and the crystalline structure of the stone. "The granite is still vibrating," he wrote. "What we're measuring isn't radiation in the normal sense, it's residual energy fossil light, trapped vibration." Attempts to record the emissions with photographic film produced strange results. Plates developed with faint circular patterns, as if light were emanating from a central source beneath the sarcophagus. The same motif appeared on multiple exposures, regardless of orientation. When overlaid, the rings formed a spiraling helix, a geometry nearly identical to the descending shaft's layout. One technician claimed the detectors spiked whenever anyone spoke near the box, as though the radiation responded to sound. The effect vanished whenever silence was maintained. Later, when a low-frequency tone was played into the chamber, a continuation of the earlier resonance tests, The readings doubled, the pulse tightening to every 24 seconds before abruptly collapsing. All instruments then fell silent. The following morning, the team found their Geiger counters drained of power despite fresh batteries. A metallic odour hung in the air, and faint grey residue coated the lid of the sarcophagus. It shimmered under lamplight, vanishing when touched. Official reports dismissed the phenomenon as instrumental anomaly, and all data logs for that week were removed from the archive. But a single handwritten note in Moreau's papers survived. It is not radiation that burns, it is memory. The stone still remembers the light that made it. One newly uncovered wall bore a cartouche written in an archaic pre-dynastic glyph. It referenced a gate beneath the horizon where the stars descend to rest. No scholar has agreed on its meaning. The inscription was discovered during the 1971 reopening, etched into a panel just above the chamber, containing the granite sarcophagus. Its surface was unusually well preserved, the carvings shallow yet sharply defined, as though they had resisted the erosion that softened every other wall. The symbols were immediately recognized as Egyptian, yet the form of their writing predates all known dynasties. The language seemed older than even the earliest hieroglyphs of Abydos, a linguistic ancestor long assumed to have vanished before Egypt existed. The team photographed the panel under filtered light, revealing pigments embedded deep in the grooves. The ochre compound used was chemically distinct from any known period pigment, containing trace elements of magnetite and hematite. These minerals, under polarized light, glowed faintly not from reflection, but from an intrinsic luminescence. It is as though the writing still remembers the torch that carved it, remarked Dr. Alain Moreau. When translated literally, the text spoke of a gate beneath the horizon, where the stars descend to rest and the gods renew their fire. But the grammar defied conventional syntax, using cyclical phrasing more akin to astronomical calculation than theology. Some words repeated in mirrored form, written both forward and backward as if describing motion, not mythology. Lenoir theorized the inscription encoded spatial directions rather than spiritual metaphor, a reference to a subterranean alignment with celestial coordinates. Further study revealed something stranger still. The dimensions of the cartouche's frame matched, to the millimeter, the proportions of the shaft below the sarcophagus chamber. When the angles of the glyphs were plotted and extended outward, they aligned with three constellations, Orion, Canis Major, and Lepus, precisely as they would have appeared in 10,500 BCE. The walls seemed to act as both text and diagram, marking a map between heaven and an underworld of stone. Epigrapher Nadia El-Masri proposed that the inscription referred to a ritual descent, not of souls, but of light. The stars descending to rest may have symbolized energy channeled from the sky into the earth. In this reading, the gate was not metaphysical at all, but a literal mechanism, an entrance to a place where cosmic power was received, stored, or transformed. Others dismissed this as poetic conjecture, yet the data from the radiation and resonance experiments supported the theory of an active energy field beneath the chamber. When the site's magnetic anomalies were overlaid with the cartouche's geometric pattern, the alignment was exact. Every glyph's endpoint coincided with a magnetic node. The inscription's final line proved most elusive. It contained a single symbol unlike any known hieroglyph, an elongated oval intersected by a spiral. Some believed it represented the sun setting beneath the horizon. Others thought it marked a motion through time. When translated phonetically, it produced a sound similar to Sha-Ta-Ra, though no scholar could find meaning in the word. In Dupont's recovered notes, however, the same term appeared once scribbled in the margin of his final journal. Shatara, the word they whispered when the stone began to hum. Whether coincidence or continuity, no one could say. But to this day, Egyptologists avoid direct translation of the phrase, calling it instead by its archival label, the Cartouche of Descent, and at the bottom of the official transcription, written in pencil by an unknown hand, there remains one final annotation, faint, almost erased. The stars did not descend. We did. In 1992, a minor quake near Dahshur collapsed part of the ceiling wall, exposing a void that matched the old expedition's forbidden shaft. Inside, modern cameras captured structures made of fused sand, glass-like, as if exposed to extreme heat. The tremor registered only 4.8 on the Richter scale, barely strong enough to rattle the nearby villages. Yet in its wake, a fissure opened along the northern edge of the plateau, precisely where DuPont's team had first mapped the descent nearly 70 years earlier. The collapse drew the attention of Egypt's Geological Survey, which dispatched a small team equipped with fiber-optic probes to assess stability. What they found beneath the cracked limestone stunned even the most seasoned investigators. At a depth of roughly 30 meters, the camera's light fell upon a smooth vertical shaft, unmistakably artificial. The walls melted into a seamless glaze. It looked nothing like carved stone. Instead, it appeared vitrified, as if the rock itself had been liquefied and cooled under controlled conditions. The texture was uniform and translucent, resembling obsidian or glassy slag found only in meteor impact sites. Initial assumptions pointed to an ancient fire, but temperature modeling quickly disproved that theory. Natural combustion could never have reached the 1,700 degrees Celsius required to fuse limestone into glass. Whatever caused this, wrote Dr. Hassan Fikri, the team's lead geophysicist, was not fire, it was energy. As the probe descended farther, it revealed a network of hollow conduits branching from the shaft, their surfaces perfectly smooth, curving in elegant spirals rather than sharp angles. Some chambers contained globules of solidified sand, frozen mid-drip, like molten glass caught in time. The coloration shifted from pale amber to deep violet, depending on the light, a gradient consistent with quartz recrystallization under intense electromagnetic exposure. Analysis of collected fragments produced another shock. Embedded within the fused matrix were traces of pure iron microspheres, magnetically aligned. This alignment could only occur under rapid heating, in a strong magnetic field conditions identical to those found during nuclear or plasma events. Yet no radiation signature accompanied the samples. The material was inert, cool, and strangely resistant to erosion. By cross-referencing the fissure's coordinates with historical expedition maps, it became clear that the void corresponded exactly with DuPont's forbidden shaft. The vertical descent his team had refused to explore beyond 700 feet. The implications were immediate. The structure still existed, untouched beneath the layers of sand and stone, and its lower reaches might never have collapsed at all. When researchers attempted to measure depth using sonar, the returning signal did not behave normally. Instead of a clear echo, the pulse seemed to bend, curving downward into silence. The sonar graph displayed a widening cone, as if space itself expanded within the shaft. "We are measuring distance," Fikri wrote, "but something is measuring us back." Within weeks, the area was cordoned off by military order. Official statements claimed the collapse posed a safety hazard, and all equipment was confiscated for further geological assessment. Privately, several researchers reported their data tapes had been erased, not corrupted, but magnetically wiped clean. Only a handful of still images survived, showing what looked like a glassy corridor vanishing into blackness. Those who viewed the footage agreed on one unsettling detail. The fused walls reflected not the camera's light, but faint geometric shapes, hexagons, and arcs of blue fire, pulsing deep within the surface as though alive. One technician who reviewed the recording before it was sealed in the archive later remarked in an interview, "That shaft wasn't destroyed by time or quake, it was sealed by heat, like something inside wanted to stay buried." A single reel of 16 film surfaced in 2008 from a private collection in Geneva, allegedly showing the 1924 descent. The footage ends abruptly when a flash of light fills the frame, followed by total darkness. The reel came to light during the liquidation of an old estate belonging to the descendants of a French cinematographer who had worked with the Antiquities Authority in the early 20th century. Inside a tin marked Project Dahshur 1924, archivists discovered a single spool of nitrate film, brittle and faintly metallic in scent. The box contained no documentation, only a short note in fading ink. Property of M. DuPont. Do not screen without filter. The footage, once digitized, ran for just under 11 minutes. It appeared to have been shot using a handheld Lumiere camera, the type commonly used in field expeditions of the 1920 seconds. The first scenes showed a group of men lowering lanterns into a pit, their faces pale in the flickering light. A rope winch was visible, along with measuring rods and a phonograph set on the sand. Handwritten slate cards identified each sequence. Descent, 18 April 1924. Then lower chamber. And finally, device in operation. What followed defied explanation. As the camera descended into the shaft, the light shimmered oddly across the walls, not like stone, but like polished metal. The frame trembled as the operator adjusted focus, revealing geometric shapes faintly etched into the surface. Several moments later, the image darkened as though the lanterns had dimmed, and a low hum began to register on the film's audio track, impossible for a camera of that era to capture. Experts confirmed the sound had been recorded through mechanical vibration, not air. At around the 7-minute mark, the footage became unstable. A faint glow appeared near the edge of the frame, intensifying with each second. The men below turned their heads upward, faces distorted in the grainy film. One raised a hand as if shielding his eyes. The light grew until it washed the frame entirely, turning the emulsion almost translucent. A few frames later, motion blurred violently, followed by a single image that appeared inverted silhouettes suspended as though weightless. Attempts to analyze the film chemically revealed peculiar results. The nitrate had fused unevenly, as though exposed to a burst of electromagnetic energy. One lab technician noted a subtle polarization in the celluloid's molecular structure, similar to damage found in high radiation environments, yet without measurable contamination. The effect seemed more like exposure to pure light than heat. Historians comparing the footage to DuPont's surviving journals noted eerie parallels. His final entry, written the same week the film was dated, describes a brilliance too white to be flame, followed by several missing hours in the team's chronology. The film appears to capture that moment, the instant the expedition reached what DuPont called the living gate. Skeptics suggested the reel was an elaborate forgery, but forensic dating placed the film stock precisely between 1923 and 1925, consistent with the original expedition. Moreover, the handwriting on the slate cards matched DuPont's known script. The odds of fabrication were astronomically low. When the Geneva archivists attempted a second screening, the projection bulb flickered violently before bursting. The film was unharmed, yet every subsequent copy produced faint interference patterns, pulsating bands of light invisible to the naked eye, but captured by digital scanners. These bands repeated every 48 frames. The reel now rests in climate-controlled storage, unreleased to the public, but those few who've seen it privately report the same uncanny detail. When the final flash fills the screen, the light forms a circular iris, like an opening eye. One viewer described it simply: it wasn't the camera that went blind, it was the world on the other side that opened. Satellite scans in 2015 revealed that the underground complex aligned perfectly with magnetic north during the Pleistocene epoch, not today's axis. Someone had built it using an ancient magnetic orientation. The discovery came from a joint geospatial study conducted by the French CNES and the Egyptian National Research Institute, initially meant to map seismic faults beneath the Dahshur Plateau. Using satellite magnetometry, researchers identified a network of subterranean anomalies, forming a precise geometric grid beneath the site, a pattern stretching nearly 5 kilometers across. At first glance, it appeared random, but when overlaid with paleomagnetic data from the late Pleistocene epoch, roughly 40,000 years ago, the alignment became exact. Every chamber, passage and shaft corresponded to magnetic north, as it existed tens of millennia before Egypt's first dynasties arose. Dr. Layla Nasser, the project's chief geophysicist, called the result chronometrically impossible. The shifting of Earth's magnetic poles is well documented, a phenomenon known as geomagnetic drift. Yet the degree of accuracy in Dahshur's subterranean layout implied either advanced knowledge of paleomagnetism or construction during that ancient alignment itself. It's not just oriented north, Nasser explained. It's oriented to a north that no longer exists. To confirm the finding, the team compared the Dahshur data to similar readings taken at Abu Rawash and Saqqara. The results were identical. Each site, though separated by kilometers and eras, aligned with the same extinct magnetic axis. Together, they formed a straight line extending toward the Red Sea, a line that matched precisely with the azimuth of Earth's magnetic pole, circa 39,800 BCE. The alignment was not architectural coincidence, it was geomagnetic intent. When the data was modeled in 3 dimensions, another revelation emerged. The resonance nodes mapped in the earlier acoustic studies followed the same paleomagnetic grid, intersecting at intervals that corresponded to harmonic ratios 1:2, 2:3, 3, 5, the same numerical relationships found in ancient musical scales and planetary orbits. It appeared the builders had designed the structure not just in alignment with a lost north, but in tune with the Earth's electromagnetic rhythm at that time. Further analysis revealed faint remnants of residual magnetization embedded in the bedrock itself. These magnetic ghosts seemed to pulse in the same 48-second cycle observed since DuPont's time, suggesting the system still retained a weak but persistent field. Attempts to map its strength produced a spiraling pattern centered beneath the lowest known chamber, a magnetic vortex that mirrored the layout of the reflection pool described decades earlier. The implications divided the scientific community. Some argued the data pointed to an unknown geological phenomenon, perhaps a buried meteor impact zone whose magnetism influenced construction choices millennia later. Others entertained a more radical view, that whoever designed the Dahshur complex had access to global magnetic knowledge lost to history. A classified annex of the report, leaked years later, hinted at even stranger conclusions. When the ancient alignment was plotted across global coordinates, several sites fell directly on the same geomagnetic line, including Göbekli Tepe, Lake Baikal's magnetic anomaly, and submerged ruins off Yonaguni, Japan. The Dahshur complex appeared not as an isolated mystery, but as one node in a global system built upon a forgotten understanding of the Earth's field. In her final published paper before the study was withdrawn, Dr. Nasser wrote a single line beneath her data charts. If magnetism is memory, then these structures remember a world that rotated differently. Shortly afterward, all high-resolution maps of the Dahshur anomalies were removed from the CNES public archive. The project was reclassified under archaeological sensitivity. Yet among researchers, one phrase continues to circulate, quietly drawn from the margin of Nasser's original notebook. The Earth once had another north, and someone built for it. Comparative analysis showed identical construction ratios to Göbekli Tepe's stone circles. Both sites used deliberate burial layers, suggesting a ritual of concealment rather than decay. The connection first emerged in 2017, when a joint Turkish-Egyptian research collaboration compared high-resolution scans of Dahshur's subterranean chambers with structural data from Göbekli Tepe's excavated enclosures in southeastern Anatolia. To the researchers' astonishment, the two sites shared a common proportional blueprint. Both featured concentric layouts whose diameters followed the same one, square root 3 ratio, a geometric pattern rarely seen in early architecture. Even more striking was the shared vertical gradient. The depth of Dahshur's lower galleries, when converted to relative scale, matched exactly the buried height of Göbekli Tepe's circular sanctuaries. The resemblance went beyond form. In both locations, the builders had intentionally entombed their creations. Göbekli Tepe's towering T-shaped pillars were buried under tons of backfilled sediment around 8000 BCE, a deliberate act of preservation, not collapse. Similarly, at Dahshur, the 1924 expedition had found every passage sealed and layered, with alternating strata of sand, gypsum, and pulverized limestone. Recent geological studies confirmed those layers were manually deposited, compacted in patterns too uniform for natural drift. In both cases, concealment appeared to be part of the design. Dr. Nasser's paleomagnetic mapping revealed another resonance. The axis of Göbekli Tepe's main enclosure, the line between its twin monoliths, aligned with the same extinct magnetic north as Dahshur. Though separated by nearly 1,000 kilometers, both sites faced the same lost pole, oriented not toward modern north but toward the Pleistocene sky. It's as though they were built to face a world that no longer exists. Nasser wrote. Linguistic analysis added further intrigue. Etchings found on a Dahshur lintel included spiral motifs identical to those carved into Göbekli Tepe's pillars, double halls representing cyclical motion. In both contexts, the spirals appeared beside depictions of animals long extinct. Aurochs, giant birds, and feline figures. These shared symbols hinted at a continuity of cosmology, a worldview older than civilization itself. One hypothesis proposed that both sites formed part of a network of ritual enclosures connected by a single purpose: the controlled burial of knowledge. The layers of sediment and stone were not ruins but vaults intended to hide something until a later time, or perhaps to prevent it from being found. Dupont's notes from 1924 echoed the same theme. They sealed what they feared, he wrote, and in sealing it, they preserved it. In 2018, an independent acoustics team compared resonance data from both sites. Göbekli Tepe's central pit vibrated naturally at 110 Hz, identical to the fundamental tone recorded in Dahshur's chambers. When overlaid digitally, their harmonic responses aligned perfectly, suggesting a shared understanding of acoustic architecture. The notion that two prehistoric cultures, separated by geography and millennia, could produce the same harmonic geometry shook conventional archaeology. Most dismissed it as coincidence, a product of universal mathematics. Yet a few researchers saw something deeper, a tradition spanning epochs, carried not by empire or language, but by encoded design. A single inscription discovered on Göbekli Tepe's Pillar 43 offered haunting context. When translated, it reads, "The ones below guard the song of the earth." When that phrase was compared to the Dahshur Cartouche, the gate beneath the horizon where the stars descend to rest, the parallel became undeniable. Both spoke of a descent, of something beneath, and of a power preserved in silence. Dr. Nasser concluded her comparative report with an understated observation. Göbekli Tepe buried its stones. Dahshur buried its light. Between them lies the same instruction to conceal until the world is ready to hear again. Is not 30s of Poweren. Dr. Hafez Ibrahim, who published the first partial translation of the lower glyphs in 2019, disappeared weeks later. His notes mentioned an equation of resonance and weightlessness derived from the wall geometry. Ibrahim was a respected epigrapher at Cairo University, quiet, meticulous, known for his insistence on evidence over speculation. For 2 decades he had specialized in early hieratic inscriptions, deciphering temple fragments that most scholars ignored as decorative. When he was granted limited access to the Dahshur transcripts declassified in 2017, he focused not on the content of the glyphs, but on their mathematical proportions. "The language isn't just words," he said in a lecture months before his disappearance. "It's a measurement system. Every curve, every angle carries numerical intention." His final paper, Resonant Syntax in Subterranean Inscriptions, published in Journal of Ancient Harmonics, explored how the glyphs' spacing mirrored ratios found in harmonic physics. He identified recurring patterns, divisions of 1, 2, 3, and 1. Square root 2 embedded within the wall inscriptions, forming what he called an equation of resonance. When plotted in 3 dimensions, the glyphs outlined a waveform identical to the frequencies measured in the lower chambers. But it was the next part of his research that raised alarm. Ibrahim hypothesized that the glyphs weren't merely descriptive. They were instructive, encoding the relationship between vibration, gravity, and spatial distortion. In one handwritten margin note, later recovered from his office, he wrote, "Resonance equals reduction of mass. Frequency equals levity." The statement was dismissed as poetic nonsense until his assistant, Mariam al-Duri, revealed he had been conducting private experiments. Using laser interferometry, he projected harmonic tones derived from the Dahshur glyph ratios onto metallic powder suspended in water. The particles formed stable, levitating nodes, tiny islands floating on sound alone. He thought he had found the equation that removes weight, she recalled. He said the glyphs were not symbols, they were instructions. Weeks before his disappearance, Ibrahim submitted a sealed envelope to the Antiquities Authority, titled Phase Geometry of the Lower Chamber. The document has never been made public. On April 16, 2019, he sent a final email to a colleague in Paris reading, "The translation is complete. The key is not in the words, it's in the silence between them." That same night, neighbors reported lights flickering in his apartment and a low humming sound audible through the walls. By morning, the door was locked from the inside. His laptop sat open on the desk, displaying the Dahshur wall diagram overlaid with sin waves and a handwritten phrase, "Delta equals 0 when f equals 110 Hz. No trace of Ibrahim was ever found. Authorities ruled the case as voluntary disappearance. But those who reviewed the scene noted unsettling details. A layer of fine dust, magnetic in nature, coated his workspace. Instruments left on the floor showed slight electrical charge, though unplugged. His metal desk was warm to the touch. The sealed envelope Ibrahim had delivered days earlier vanished from the archive shortly afterward. Internal correspondence between departments referred cryptically to material inconsistency in the deposit, a phrase never clarified. In the years since, his colleagues have referred to the missing paper only as the equation of levity. The few who have read fragments describe it as a formula, combining harmonic frequencies with mass ratios, a theoretical framework linking sound and gravitational potential. "It reads like a hymn written by a physicist," one said. To this day, Ibrahim's final words remain engraved on the corner of his abandoned chalkboard, preserved behind glass at Cairo University's Department of Antiquities. The ancients didn't build to defy gravity. They built to remember how to release it. Seismic scans in 2022 suggested that the lowest chamber lies below the natural bedrock line, physically impossible without tunneling through solid granite. Yet no signs of drilling exist. The discovery came during a remote subsurface imaging project conducted by Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, in collaboration with the European Seismic Consortium. Using muon tomography, the same particle detection technique that revealed hidden cavities inside the Great Pyramid. The team detected a void nearly 140 meters beneath the recorded base of the Dahshur complex. The chamber's estimated dimensions were staggering: 30 meters wide, oval in shape, and aligned precisely with the downward axis of the so-called forbidden shaft. But the data revealed something stranger still. The chamber appeared to exist beneath the geological stratum of the plateau, a depth where only solid granite should exist. The rock density at that level was thought to be impenetrable, even to modern drilling equipment, yet the scans showed a clear, continuous space surrounded by perfectly smooth boundaries. No fissures, no excavation scars, no tool marks. It was as if the granite had parted cleanly and re-solidified around a hollow cavity. Lead geophysicist Dr. Lena Moretti described it bluntly. It's as though the stone had been liquefied and refrozen, but the temperature required for that would have melted the entire region. The data doesn't make geological sense. Further analysis deepened the mystery. The seismic waves that passed through the anomaly slowed down dramatically, as though moving through a less dense medium but not air. The readings resembled resonance through crystalline matter, similar to quartz under high compression. "It's not empty," Moretti said. "It's something else. Something structured." Attempts to model the energy signature of the anomaly revealed repeating patterns consistent with standing sound waves. The resonance frequencies matched the same 110 Hz fundamental tone that had recurred in every previous Dahshur study, from DuPont's field notes in 1924 to the acoustic mapping in the 1970 seconds. In other words, the void below the bedrock appeared to vibrate in harmony with the chambers above it, as though forming the final note of a buried instrument. Geologists proposed a simple explanation: instrument error, or reflections from denser rock, but repeated measurements from independent arrays produced identical results. Even NASA's magnetotelluric sensors, deployed during a joint Earth conductivity survey, confirmed a secondary electromagnetic pulse emanating from the same coordinates, cycling every 48 seconds. When the data was converted into a 3D model, the chamber's curvature aligned perfectly with the ancient magnetic north, the same extinct pole orientation identified in earlier paleomagnetic studies. It seemed to represent the culmination of all the site's alignments: geometry, sound, and magnetism, converging in one impossible space. Unofficially, several members of the research team proposed an unsettling hypothesis. The chamber might not be a structure at all, but a region of altered density, a zone where matter itself had been reconfigured. One physicist compared it to a geological scar left by a field effect, like the negative imprint of something that once existed and withdrew. Government oversight committees quickly restricted access to the Dahshur site after the findings leaked. Public statements referred only to geological instability and unverified imaging artifacts. However, satellite monitoring showed temporary power outages across Dahshur during the following week, as though local grids had been momentarily disrupted by magnetic interference. Dr. Moretti's final unpublished note, later circulated among colleagues, contained only a single paragraph written in pencil. The lowest chamber may not be below the rock. The rock may be above it, resting on something that was never meant to be seen. The Dahshur anomaly remains officially classified. To this day, no expedition has been granted access to drill or descend, yet seismic equipment left nearby continues to pick up a faint pulse, steady, patient, and unchanged, echoing upward every 48 seconds from the depths of stone. During a 2023 resurvey, scientists recorded unexplained flashes of light within the sealed corridor. The wavelengths matched neither electric discharge nor camera flash but auroral spectra. The phenomenon occurred during a non-invasive optical mapping project designed to reassess Dahshur's sealed interior without excavation. Using fiber optic borescopes and hyperspectral imaging, The team from Cairo University's geophysics department threaded cameras through existing cracks in the limestone cap. The goal was simple: confirm the stability of the lower chambers after decades of seismic inactivity. Yet the first night of observation produced something no one expected. At 2:47 a.m. local time, one of the interior sensors positioned deep within the corridor, leading toward the reflection pool, recorded a sudden bloom of illumination. The light was not constant, nor was it directional. It pulsed softly, expanding through the air like mist, then fading. Each pulse lasted less than 2 seconds, repeating irregularly over a span of 20 minutes. What stunned the researchers most was its spectral fingerprint. The wavelengths corresponded to auroral emissions, the same green and violet bands seen in Earth's upper atmosphere. Dr. Leyla Osman, lead optical physicist on the team, described the light as a terrestrial aurora but underground. There was no ionized gas present, no electromagnetic discharge, and no equipment capable of generating such spectra. The illumination appeared to emerge from the air itself, diffused and silent. When the footage was slowed, the light's expansion pattern resembled concentric ripples like waves moving through invisible water. When spectrographs were analyzed, the emission line near 557.7 nanometers, the telltale signature of atomic oxygen, appeared unmistakably. But atomic oxygen cannot exist in sealed subterranean environments. Either the chamber is producing it locally, Osman said, or the light is a different phenomenon entirely, one that mimics auroral behavior without sharing its chemistry. To rule out reflection, the team conducted a second test. All external light sources were disabled, yet at precisely the same time the following night, the sensors captured the same pulses, synchronized almost perfectly with the site's long-documented 48-second magnetic rhythm. Each burst coincided with a slight rise in electromagnetic flux and a barely perceptible temperature increase less than half a degree. When the recordings were compiled into time-lapse, a pattern emerged. The flashes traced a faint spiral, the same geometry etched into the walls near the Untranslated Cartouche. The spiral expanded, then contracted, as though breathing. One pulse in particular, captured at 3:19 a.m., illuminated a portion of the corridor wall, revealing faint engravings no one had documented before, interlocking rings, forming what appeared to be a map or perhaps an equation rendered in light. Attempts to reproduce the effect under laboratory conditions failed. The wavelengths could not be replicated through mechanical vibration, static charge, or photoluminescent mineral excitation. The light seemed to occur only in situ, within the geometry of the sealed corridor. Osman's later report proposed a radical interpretation. If the chamber functions as a resonant cavity, she wrote, then the light may not be illumination as we understand it, but an optical interference pattern, a visible byproduct of harmonics between the magnetic field and the crystalline matrix of the rock. 2 days after the final recording, all fiber optic feeds went dead simultaneously. The cables remained intact, but their sensors returned nothing but static, a rhythmic interference, cycling every 48 seconds. Subsequent maintenance crews reported faint residual glow inside the lenses, as if the light had imprinted itself onto the glass. When asked whether she believed the flashes were natural, Osman hesitated. "Natural?" she said quietly. "Perhaps. But nature doesn't usually wait 100 years between pulses." Her final field entry, written in the margins of the report, summarized what she could not publish. "The corridor is waking itself. The light is not returning. It was never gone." Among the last fragments recovered was a phrase, "The sky was mirrored below." Egyptologists argue whether it refers to an astronomical map or a literal reflection hidden deep beneath the sand. The fragment came from a broken limestone panel unearthed in 2023, its edges scorched and partially vitrified, the same glass-like finish seen near the collapsed shaft. The inscription was faint, etched in a form of early hieratic script barely decipherable except under ultraviolet light. The incomplete line read, "When the sun crossed twice, the sky was mirrored below, and the gate stood open without shadow. It's not Tepe flotted be 5. The wording immediately split the academic community. Some scholars interpreted it as a poetic metaphor for the ancient Egyptian underworld, a reflection of the heavens where souls journeyed after death. Others, however, saw something more literal, the description of no shadow and sky mirrored below, echoed both Dupont's century-old notes about the reflection pool and modern discoveries of optical anomalies deep beneath Dahshur. The possibility arose that the text referred not to myth, but to an engineered phenomenon, an actual mirror, constructed in the earth to reflect the heavens. When translated phonetically, the term used for mirror was not the standard Ankh or Heseb, but a far older form meaning balance or equal weight. Linguist Dr. Selim Rauf proposed that the inscription described an act of calibration aligning heaven and earth through light. It may have been a map, he said, but not drawn in ink, a reflection that only appears when resonance, magnetism, and geometry converge. To test the theory, researchers compared the inscription's measurements with the dimensions of the lower chambers. When modelled in 3D, the placement of the walls and shafts reproduced the relative positions of several constellations as they appeared 20,000 years ago: Orion, Canis Major, and the Pleiades. The structure seemed designed to replicate the sky underground, an inversion of the cosmos. A mirror not of light, but of structure. Dupont had hinted at this concept in his unpublished notes, describing a pool that reflects what is above, but shows what lies beneath. Modern instruments supported his intuition. Magnetometric readings taken in 2022 displayed a symmetrical pattern, a mirror image of the night sky's electromagnetic signature, mapped directly below the plateau. The sky was mirrored below, it seemed, was not poetic at all but observational. The final glyph in the phrase remained untranslated. It appeared as a circle, intersected by a downward arrow, a symbol absent from any known Egyptian lexicon. When viewed under polarized light, it shimmered faintly, as though metallic residue had fused to the stone. One epigrapher suggested it might denote inversion, the turning of one world into another. Curiously, when the symbol's geometry was analysed mathematically, it corresponded to a spiral with a ratio of 1, square root 3, the same harmonic ratio found in the reflection pool's diameter and in Göbekli Tepe's central ring. The phrase isn't just describing reflection, Rauf said. It's describing recursion, a loop between the sky and its image. In the months following the fragment's discovery, several photographs of the inscription began circulating online before being swiftly removed from academic databases. Official explanations cited copyright concerns, but researchers privately confirmed a more unsettling detail. In one enhanced image, the mirrored glyphs appeared to glow faintly, as though reflecting a light not present in the room. A final note in the excavation log, written by a field assistant before the site was resealed, captured the unease shared by everyone who saw the stone firsthand. When we stood before it, it was not the stars that looked mirrored, it was us. Today, the site remains sealed again under government protection. No official footage has been released. What the 1,924 team truly encountered below Dahshur remains a matter of quiet speculation. But one phrase continues to appear in their surviving field diaries. We descended expecting stone. We found something that looked back. Nearly a century after the descent, the mystery of the Dahshur complex endures a silence buried beneath the desert, shielded by layers of time, bureaucracy, and fear. The original site lies hidden once more under tons of limestone and sand, guarded not only by its geology but by official decrees that forbid any future excavation. To the outside world, it is nothing more than a closed archaeological zone. But within scientific circles, the question remains unresolved. What, if anything, lies beyond that final sealed corridor? Every generation of researchers who revisits DuPont's notebooks encounters the same haunting consistencies. The 48-second pulse, the magnetized granite, the vanished artifacts, the inscriptions referencing light that breathes beneath the earth. None have been satisfactorily explained. Each investigation, from the seismic surveys of the 1,970 seconds to the spectral studies of the 2,020 seconds, has revealed echoes of the same phenomenon repeating across decades, as if the site itself remembers. Dr. Layla Osman once wrote that the Dahshur structure behaves like a recording medium, not a tomb, but a memory, replaying fragments of whatever force or intelligence shaped it. Her observation remains one of the few attempts to bridge science and myth without abandoning either. "We think of memory as something stored," she said. "But what if memory is something that continues to happen?" That question lingers over Dahshur like a shadow. The desert has reclaimed the excavation pits, and the old entrance is now invisible beneath wind-scoured dunes. Only the magnetic instruments set around the perimeter continue to measure faint anomalies, rhythmic pulses buried in static, still cycling every 48 seconds, still perfectly synchronized to the Earth's quiet hum. Most of the surviving artifacts from the expedition are locked away in private archives, their locations redacted. The film reel in Geneva remains unseen by the public. The translated fragments, "The sky was mirrored below," and "The gate beneath the horizon" remain incomplete sentences, as if deliberately left unfinished. It's as though the ancient builders wanted their creation to resist closure, to remain an open equation. In DuPont's final letter to his superiors, written weeks before his death, he confessed a thought that had troubled him since the descent. "The deeper we went, the less we measured the earth and the more it measured us." That sentence was never published in any scientific journal, but among those who have read the surviving field logs, it is spoken quietly, a warning or perhaps an admission, and so the gate beneath the sand remains unseen, unheard, yet never silent. Beneath the weight of history and dust, something continues to resonate in the dark, pulsing with the rhythm of a long-forgotten frequency. Whether it is geological, mechanical, or something neither, no one can say. All that is known is that the readings persist, faint, steady, unchanging, as if waiting for another descent, another moment when human curiosity dares to listen again. If the ancient inscription was correct, if the sky was mirrored below, then perhaps the reflection is still there, hidden in the earth's deepest silence. A mirror that does not show light, but consciousness. And perhaps, when the gate opens once more, what lies beneath won't be a discovery at all, but a recognition.